Picture this. It's 11 p.m. the night before what should be the happiest day of your life. Your mother hands you a cup of warm tea. For your nerves, sweetheart. You trust her. You drink it. And that's when your world shatters forever. As the sedative kicked in, I heard my sister's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Cut her hair off or you'll lose me forever. Through my drugged haze, I watched my own mother pick up electric clippers. The woman who raised me, who promised to love me unconditionally. She chose my golden child sister over me in that moment, and the buzzing sound that followed would haunt me forever. I woke up on my wedding morning completely bald, humiliated, betrayed by my own blood. But here's what my family didn't know: I had allies they never saw coming, evidence they never imagined existed, and a plan that would turn their perfect Southern wedding into their worst nightmare. Because when those chapel doors opened and 200 guests saw my bald head, the room didn't just fall silent, it exploded. Audio recordings played, receipts appeared on screens, secrets spanning 3 generations came crashing down like dominoes. What happened next didn't just destroy my family's reputation, it shattered a cycle of abuse that had poisoned our bloodline for decades. By the end of this story, you'll witness the most satisfying revenge you've ever heard, and understand why sometimes the most broken people become the strongest warriors. This is my story, and trust me, you've never heard anything like it. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, and at 32, I thought I had finally escaped the suffocating grip of my Southern Belle mother's expectations. As a successful marketing director for a tech company in Atlanta, I'd built a life 2 hours away from my hometown of Magnolia Springs, Georgia, far enough to breathe, close enough to maintain the facade of family harmony that meant everything to my parents. Tomorrow was supposed to be my wedding day, the culmination of 2 years of planning that had turned into a battleground between my vision of an intimate celebration and my mother's dream of a grand Southern spectacle that would cement our family's status as the crown jewel of our gated community. The evening air was thick with Georgia humidity as I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the pale pink wallpaper and antique furniture that had remained unchanged since I was 16. My parents, Charles and Margaret Montgomery, had insisted I spend my final night as a single woman in the house where I grew up, a tradition they claimed that would bring good luck to the marriage. Charles served as chairman of the Magnolia Hills Homeowners Association and was a deacon at First Baptist Church, while Margaret led the Ladies' Auxiliary and hosted the most coveted dinner parties in our zip code. To the outside world, we were the picture-perfect American family, successful, devout, and unshakably united. The truth was far more complicated. "Sweetheart, you look absolutely exhausted," my mother said as she glided into my room carrying a delicate china teacup on a silver tray. Margaret Montgomery never simply walked anywhere. She glided, floated, or swept as if perpetually auditioning for the role of Southern matriarch in some grand production. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, and her silk nightgown probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I brought you some chamomile tea with a little something extra to help calm those pre-wedding jitters." I should have been suspicious. In 32 years, my mother had never once brought me tea for any reason, let alone to soothe my nerves. But the stress of the past few months had worn me down, the constant battles over guest lists, flower arrangements, and wedding traditions I didn't want but couldn't seem to escape. The tea smelled like home, like the antique rose garden my grandmother had planted behind the house, and I was desperate for anything that might quiet the anxiety churning in my stomach. "Thank you, Mama," I said, accepting the cup with both hands. The liquid was warm and sweet with an underlying bitter note that I attributed to the chamomile. "I really am nervous about tomorrow." "Oh, honey, every bride feels this way," she said, settling onto the edge of my bed with the practiced grace of someone who had perfected the art of appearing nurturing while maintaining emotional distance. "Your sister Melissa felt the exact same way before her engagement party last month. Speaking of which, where is that girl? She was supposed to come say goodnight." As if summoned by her name, Melissa burst through the bedroom door with the dramatic flair that had defined her personality since childhood. At 28, My younger sister had inherited our mother's delicate features, and our father's commanding presence, creating a combination that had opened doors and melted hearts throughout her life. While I had always been the responsible one, good grades, steady job, sensible choices. Melissa was the golden child who could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. "Sorry I'm late," she announced. Her cheeks flushed and her eyes unnaturally bright. "I was on the phone with Brad trying to convince him to propose already. I mean, Sarah's getting married tomorrow, and I've been with Brad for 6 months longer than she's been with David." I felt the familiar sting of comparison that had poisoned our relationship since childhood, but the tea was already making me drowsy, dulling the sharp edges of my irritation. My eyelids grew heavy and the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if I were viewing everything through water. "Melissa, don't be ridiculous," our mother said, but her tone lacked conviction. "Everyone has their own timeline." "Do they, though?" Melissa's voice took on a sharp edge that cut through my growing haze. "Because I'm tired of being overshadowed. I'm tired of Sarah getting everything first just because she's older. I'm tired of being the afterthought." The teacup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. I tried to stand to clean up the mess, but my legs wouldn't support me. The room spun faster now, and I had to grip the bedpost to keep from falling. "What did you put in that tea?" I managed to whisper. But the words came out slurred and distant. Melissa stepped closer, her face transforming into something I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "Cut her hair off," she said, her voice rising to just below a scream. "Or you'll lose me forever. I swear to God, Mama, if you don't do this one thing for me, I will walk out of this house tonight and you will never see me again." Through the sedative fog, I watched my mother's face crumple as if Melissa had physically struck her. Margaret Montgomery, who prided herself on maintaining control in every situation, began to cry, not the delicate tears of a Southern lady, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her entire body. "Please don't make me choose," she whispered, but we all knew she already had. The sound of clippers cutting through my hair, and I knew I'd lost much more than just my appearance. Consciousness returned slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a murky pond. My mouth tasted like cotton and copper, and there was a strange coolness across my scalp that I couldn't immediately place. The morning light filtering through my childhood bedroom curtains seemed harsher than usual, and when I tried to sit up, the world tilted dangerously to one side. The sedative still clung to my system like cobwebs, making every movement feel sluggish and disconnected. It wasn't until I swung my legs over the edge of the bed that I noticed the hair. Thick, dark strands scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves catching the sunlight in a way that made my stomach lurch. My hand instinctively went to my head, expecting to feel the familiar weight of the shoulder-length waves I'd been growing out for 2 years specifically for this day. Instead, my palm met bare skin. The walk to my bathroom mirror felt like crossing a desert. Each step brought a growing sense of dread that crystallized into horror the moment I flicked on the overhead light. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable. Where my hair had been, there were only uneven patches of stubble and angry red welts where the clippers had been pressed too hard against my scalp. Melissa hadn't just cut my hair, she had scalped me with the precision of someone who wanted to inflict maximum damage. I raised trembling fingers to trace the geography of my destruction. The skin was tender and raw in places with tiny cuts that had scabbed over during the night. Some areas were completely bald, while others had tufts of hair no longer than a 1/4 inch, creating a landscape of humiliation that no amount of makeup or strategic lighting could disguise. The sensation of touching my own scalp was alien and violating, as if I were exploring someone else's body. My fingertips, usually soft from expensive hand cream, felt rough and foreign against the unfamiliar texture of exposed skin. The bathroom door creaked open behind me and I saw my mother's reflection join mine in the mirror. Margaret Montgomery looked like she had aged a decade overnight. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her silk nightgown wrinkled, and her carefully maintained composure had cracked like old paint. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other's reflections, two women standing in the wreckage of a relationship that could never be repaired. "Sarah, honey," she began, her voice carefully modulated in that tone she used when trying to manage a crisis at one of her charity events. "You're still beautiful in your own way. Hair grows back and there are lovely wigs we can find for today. Nobody has to know what really happened." The casual dismissal of my violation hit me like a physical blow. She was already spinning the narrative, already crafting the lie that would protect the family's reputation while erasing my pain. Before I could respond, my father's voice drifted in from the hallway, cold and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "At least today you won't overshadow her," Charles Montgomery said as he appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He was already dressed in his wedding day attire, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression as emotionally vacant as ever. "Melissa deserves her moment to shine, and frankly, you've always been a bit too dramatic about being the center of attention." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread outward until they reached the deepest corners of my memory. This wasn't the first time. It had never been the first time. I remembered my high school graduation when Melissa had thrown a tantrum about my valedictorian speech stealing her thunder and how my parents had suggested I keep my remarks brief so she could give the closing prayer instead. I remembered my college acceptance to Emory News that was buried because Melissa had gotten her driver's license the same week and needed to celebrate. I remembered birthdays where my achievements were minimized, and Christmas mornings where her gifts were always bigger, always better, always accompanied by explanations about how she was going through a difficult phase and needed extra attention. The pattern stretched back decades, a continuous thread of sacrificing my happiness for the sake of preserving Melissa's fragile ego and my parents' image as the family who had successfully raised two accomplished daughters. Except they hadn't raised two accomplished daughters. They had raised one golden child and one scapegoat, one princess and one servant whose only purpose was to make the princess look better by comparison. I gripped the marble edge of the bathroom sink until my knuckles turned white, using the physical anchor to keep myself steady as the full weight of my situation crashed over me. This was my wedding day. The day I had planned for 2 years, spent thousands of dollars on, and invited 200 people to witness. The day that was supposed to mark the beginning of my new life as David's wife and my final escape from this toxic family dynamic. Instead, I looked like a cancer patient or a mental health crisis, and my own parents were standing there acting like I was being unreasonable for being upset about it. But as I stared at my reflection, something else began to emerge alongside the shock and hurt. It started as a small flame in my chest, no bigger than a candle's flicker, but it grew with each dismissive word from my parents and each memory of past betrayals. This wasn't just about hair. This was about 32 years of being told that my feelings didn't matter, that my needs were secondary, that my role in this family was to be invisible so that Melissa could be luminous. The flame became a fire, and the fire became something harder and more dangerous than rage. It became resolve. I placed my hand on my scalp and swore tomorrow they would be the ones trembling. Standing in that bathroom staring at my destroyed reflection, the memories came flooding back with crystalline clarity. This pattern of sacrifice and favoritism hadn't started last night. It had been the defining characteristic of my entire life, woven so seamlessly into our family dynamic that I had almost convinced myself it was normal. Almost. I was 14 when I first noticed how differently my parents treated us at Magnolia Springs High School's annual spring formal. Melissa was only 10 then, but she was already the apple of everyone's eye with her cascade of golden curls and her ability to charm adults with practiced Southern Belle mannerisms that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. The night of my freshman formal, I had saved money from babysitting to buy a modest blue dress from the outlet mall, and I thought I looked beautiful. I felt confident walking into the decorated gymnasium with my date Tommy Peterson, the shy boy from my chemistry class who had stammered through asking me to dance for 3 weeks before finally working up the courage. But when I arrived home that night glowing with the memory of slow dances and teenage romance, my mother barely looked up from the couch where she was helping Melissa practice her posture for some future cotillion that was still 4 years away. "How was it, dear?" Margaret asked absently, her attention focused entirely on adjusting Melissa's shoulders. "Did you remember to keep your voice down? You know how you get when you're excited, a little too animated for a proper Southern lady." The criticism stung, but what happened the following week stung worse. When the formal photos were distributed at school, I proudly brought home the picture of Tommy and me, thinking my parents might want to display it alongside the other family photographs that lined our hallway. Instead, my mother glanced at it briefly and said, "Oh, honey, you look so serious. Melissa would have smiled bigger. She has such a natural camera presence. Maybe next time you could take some lessons from your sister about how to be more charming in social situations." That same year, Melissa started attending the junior cotillion classes at the country club, where she quickly became the star pupil. Every Thursday evening, my parents would dress her in tiny white gloves and a pink dress, driving her to the club while I stayed home to finish homework. When they returned, the conversation at dinner would revolve entirely around Melissa's progress, how the instructor had praised her natural grace, how the other parents had commented on her poise. I learned to eat quickly and excuse myself before the glowing reports began, retreating to my room where I could focus on my studies without the constant reminder that my academic achievements were apparently less noteworthy than my 10-year-old sister's ability to curtsy properly. The financial disparities became impossible to ignore during our high school years. When Melissa turned 16, our parents surprised her with a brand new pearl-white BMW complete with a giant red bow tied to the antenna. They presented it to her on a random Tuesday in March, claiming it was an early birthday present because they had found such a good deal and wanted to make sure she had reliable transportation for all her social activities. The entire neighborhood came out to admire the car, and Margaret spent the afternoon taking photos of Melissa posing beside it, uploading them to every social media platform she could access. Meanwhile, I had been working 25 hours a week at Grounds for Happiness, the local coffee shop downtown, saving every penny for college application fees and hoping to build enough of a nest egg to supplement whatever financial aid I might receive. When I asked my parents about getting a car or even borrowing money for a used one, my father handed me a bus schedule and told me that public transportation would teach me valuable life skills about time management and personal responsibility. He said it with the tone of someone bestowing wisdom, as if making me wait 40 minutes for a bus in Georgia humidity was some kind of character-building exercise that would ultimately benefit my moral development. The worst betrayal came during my senior year when I received notification that I had been awarded the Peachtree Scholar Award, a full academic scholarship to the University of Georgia that was given to only 12 students statewide. I was beyond thrilled this scholarship would cover not just tuition, but room board and books, essentially guaranteeing my freedom and future without burdening my family financially. I rushed home with the letter practically floating through the front door, ready to share the best news of my life with the people who were supposed to love and support me most. I found my mother in the kitchen, uploading photos to the Magnolia Hills neighborhood Facebook group. But instead of celebrating my scholarship, she was posting a series of professional photographs of Melissa in her junior prom dress, a stunning emerald gown that had cost more than I made in 3 months at the coffee shop. The captions gushed about Melissa's natural beauty and her bright future, mentioning how proud the family was to have such a shining star representing our community values. I stood there holding my scholarship letter, watching my mother craft post after post about Melissa's dress, her hair, her potential modeling career, her perfect complexion. When I finally interrupted to share my news, Margaret glanced at the letter briefly and said, "Oh, that's nice, sweetheart. Very practical. Now, do you think I should mention that Melissa's dress was featured in the boutique's window display, or would that sound too much like bragging?" That night I searched the neighborhood Facebook group for any mention of my scholarship. There was nothing, not a single word about the academic achievement that would change the trajectory of my entire life. But there were 17 photos of Melissa in that emerald dress, each one garnering dozens of likes and comments about how lucky our family was to have such a beautiful daughter. There was something from that year I'd never forgiven, and now it was coming back sharper than ever. The memories of those years crystallized into a painful understanding of exactly why my parents had been willing to drug and humiliate me on the eve of my wedding. For the Montgomery family reputation wasn't just important, it was everything. It was the currency that bought them respect at the country club, influence in the church, and authority in our gated community. And they had spent decades building that reputation on the foundation of what everyone believed was a picture-perfect family. My father's position as chairman of the Magnolia Hills Homeowners Association wasn't just a volunteer role, it was his throne. Every third Thursday of the month, our formal dining room transformed into a command center where Charles Montgomery held court over property values, landscaping violations, and the sacred covenants that kept our neighborhood pristine. I had watched him orchestrate these meetings since childhood, observing how he wielded his authority with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. He would stand at the head of our mahogany table, gesturing toward printed reports and architectural plans, while the other board members hung on his every word. During these gatherings, my mother would glide between the kitchen and dining room, serving her famous praline cake and sweet tea in crystal glasses that had been in her family for 4 generations. She never spoke during the official proceedings, but her presence was essential to the performance. Margaret Montgomery was the living embodiment of Southern hospitality, the gracious hostess whose very existence proved that traditional values and family stability still thrived in our rapidly changing world. The other wives would compliment her on everything from her flower arrangements to her daughter's accomplishments, and she would deflect with practiced modesty, while ensuring that every positive detail about our family was subtly woven into the conversation. The church committee meetings followed a similar pattern, though, with an added layer of moral authority that made my parents practically untouchable in our community. First Baptist Church of Magnolia Springs wasn't just where we worshiped. It was where social hierarchies were established and maintained through a complex web of committee positions, volunteer roles, and financial contributions. My father had served as a deacon for 15 years, while my mother led the Ladies' Auxiliary and organized the annual charity auction that raised funds for the children's ministry. Together, they represented everything the congregation aspired to be: successful, devoted, and blessed, with a family that reflected God's favor. I had lost count of how many times I had heard my parents referenced as examples during sermons or Sunday school lessons. Pastor Williams would speak about the importance of raising children with strong Christian values, and inevitably someone would mention how fortunate the church was to have families like the Montgomerys, who had produced 2 daughters destined for bright futures. The irony was suffocating. Our family was held up as a model of Christian love and support when the reality behind closed doors was manipulation, favoritism, and emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty. The wedding itself had been planned as the ultimate performance, a grand finale to decades of careful image management. When David and I announced our engagement 18 months ago, my mother immediately began treating the event like a political campaign, with guest lists that read like a who's who of Magnolia Springs society. The invitation list included not just family and friends, but every influential person in our community: the mayor and his wife, the bank president, the country club, board of directors, and naturally Pastor Williams and his entire family. Margaret had explained that a wedding was an opportunity to celebrate our blessings, while demonstrating our family's continued prominence in the social fabric of our town. She had chosen Magnolia Hills Country Club as the venue specifically because it was the most prestigious location in our area, the kind of place where exclusivity was measured not just by membership fees, but by generational legacy. The ballroom where my reception would take place had hosted the wedding celebrations of senators' daughters and Fortune 500 executives' children. Having our family celebration in that sacred space would cement our status among the community elite, while providing the perfect backdrop for the hundreds of photographs that would eventually grace our Christmas cards and social media accounts for years to come. But now, standing in my childhood bathroom with my scalp bearing the evidence of my family's true nature, I understood that this wedding had never been about celebrating my happiness or honoring my relationship with David. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the Montgomery family brand, a spectacular demonstration of our ability to raise successful, beautiful daughters who married well and reflected positively on their upbringing. Melissa's jealousy and my parents' willingness to accommodate it had revealed the ugly truth beneath decades of carefully maintained facades. As I watched my parents hover in the bathroom doorway, I noticed something that might have escaped me in the immediate shock of discovery. Neither of them could look directly at my head. My father kept his eyes fixed on a point just over my left shoulder, while my mother stared intently at her own reflection in the mirror, as if seeing my destruction might somehow contaminate her own appearance. They were already calculating the damage to their reputation, already crafting explanations and contingency plans to minimize the social fallout from what they had done. The realization hit me like lightning. They weren't worried about my pain or my humiliation. They were terrified that their carefully constructed image might crumble when 200 of their closest friends and most important social contacts saw what they had allowed to happen to their elder daughter. The very stage they had designed to showcase their family's perfection would instead become the platform for their complete destruction. If they worshipped image, I would destroy them on that very stage under the blinding lights. The sound of footsteps on the hardwood stairs interrupted the tense silence that had settled over my bathroom like a burial shroud. My parents immediately straightened their faces, transforming into masks of casual normalcy with the practiced ease of decades of social performance. But I recognized those particular footsteps measured deliberate and completely unintimidated by the Montgomery family's carefully orchestrated drama. Aunt Ruth had arrived. Ruth Montgomery Whitfield was my father's older sister, a woman who had earned her independence through 40 years of teaching high school English, and had never felt the need to apologize for speaking uncomfortable truths. At 68, she moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had witnessed enough family secrets to be shocked by very little. Unlike my parents, who measured their worth through community approval and social standing, Ruth had built her life around books, students, and a small circle of genuine friendships that had sustained her through decades of watching the Montgomery family dysfunction from the periphery. "Well, well," she said as she appeared in the bathroom doorway, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic neat bun, and her blue eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision of someone assessing a particularly complex piece of literature. "I see we're having quite the morning drama." My mother immediately launched into damage control mode, her voice taking on that artificially bright tone she used when trying to convince people that catastrophes were actually blessings in disguise. "Ruth, thank goodness you're here early. Sarah had a little accident with some scissors last night. You know how nervous brides can get, and we're just figuring out the best way to style what's left for the ceremony." The lie was so blatant, so insulting to everyone's intelligence that I felt a fresh wave of rage wash over me. But Ruth simply raised one silver eyebrow and stepped fully into the bathroom, her presence immediately shifting the balance of power in the room. She had a way of occupying space that made everyone else feel smaller and less significant, not through intimidation but through the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades teaching teenagers and had therefore developed an immunity to manipulation and deception. "Charles Margaret," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she had probably used with countless students caught cheating on examinations. "I think Sarah and I need a few minutes alone. Perhaps you could go downstairs and start preparing breakfast for your guests." It wasn't a suggestion, and everyone in the room understood that. My parents exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that long-married couples develop before reluctantly retreating from the bathroom. I could hear their whispered conversation beginning before they even reached the stairs, no doubt crafting their next strategy for containing the damage to their reputation. Ruth waited until their footsteps faded before closing the bathroom door with a soft click. Then she reached into the large canvas bag she always carried and pulled out a collection of silk scarves in various shades of blue and gray, their fabric so soft and fine that they seemed to catch and hold the morning light. Without saying a word, she approached me and began gently draping one of the scarves around my head, her movements tender and careful, in a way that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I've known about this for a long time," she said quietly, her fingers working with practiced skill to arrange the scarf in a way that covered my scalp while still looking elegant and intentional. Not the specific details of last night, but the pattern, the favoritism, the way they've always been willing to sacrifice your happiness to preserve Melissa's ego and their own social standing. Her words broke something loose inside me, and I found myself leaning into her touch like a child seeking comfort from the only adult who had ever offered it without conditions or expectations. Ruth had always been the family outlier, the Montgomery who had chosen books over babies, career over marriage, and truth over social acceptability. During my childhood, she had been the one who remembered my academic achievements and celebrated my small victories with the kind of genuine enthusiasm my parents reserved exclusively for Melissa's social triumphs. "The thing is, sweetheart," Ruth continued, now securing the scarf with a small pin shaped like a silver leaf, "technology has changed the game. These days everything is recorded. Your parents installed that new doorbell camera system just last month. You know, the kind that's always recording, always watching. Technology is like a silent witness now, capturing truths that people think they can hide." The implications of her words hit me immediately. If the doorbell camera had been recording last night, it would have captured Melissa's ultimatum, my parents' conversation, maybe even the sound of the clippers. Evidence. Real, undeniable proof of what had been done to me and why. For the first time since waking up, I felt something other than despair and rage. I felt the stirring of possibility. Ruth seemed to read my thoughts because she smiled with the satisfied expression of a teacher watching a student reach the correct conclusion. "Now, I happen to know that young man who handles the audio-visual equipment at the country club, Tommy Chen, graduated from my AP English class 3 years ago. Bright boy, very good with technology, and absolutely devoted to the idea that truth should prevail over convenience. I think he might be very interested in helping you prepare a little private performance for this afternoon." As she spoke, Ruth's hand moved to stroke my scalp through the soft fabric of the scarf, her touch carrying all the maternal comfort that had been missing from my actual mother's interactions. It was a gesture so simple and yet so profound that it made me realize how starved I had been for genuine affection, for someone to touch me with kindness rather than manipulation or control. "You're not alone in this, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and the promise of unwavering support. "Some battles can't be won with silence and submission. Sometimes the only way to break a cycle is to shine a light so bright that everyone can see exactly what's been happening in the shadows." I lifted my head. Maybe I wasn't alone, and the darkness was beginning to lift. Ruth's words echoed in my mind as she quietly slipped out of the bathroom, leaving me alone with my reflection and a clarity I hadn't possessed an hour earlier. The woman staring back at me was no longer a victim. She was someone with options, with allies, and most importantly, with the intelligence to turn this disaster into something far more powerful than my family had ever imagined possible. I reached up and carefully removed Ruth's silk scarf, studying my bare scalp in the harsh bathroom lighting. What had been done to humiliate me could become my greatest weapon. The wedding dress hanging in my closet had been chosen months ago during a shopping trip that had devolved into yet another battle between my preferences and my mother's vision of how a Montgomery bride should appear. She had pushed for something elaborate and traditional, with layers of tulle and intricate beadwork that would photograph beautifully and demonstrate our family's refined taste. I had wanted something simpler, more elegant, but had eventually compromised on a gown that satisfied her need for spectacle while still feeling authentically mine. Now, looking at that dress with new eyes, I realized it was perfect for an entirely different reason. The gown was crafted from ivory silk with clean, minimalist lines that emphasized the wearer rather than overwhelming her. The neckline was modest but striking, and most importantly, it came with a cathedral-length veil made from the finest tulle that was so sheer it was almost transparent. My mother had insisted on the dramatic veil, claiming it would create stunning photographs as it trailed behind me down the aisle. She had envisioned it framing my face and hair, like a cloud of ethereal beauty. Instead, it would serve as the perfect backdrop for my revelation. As I held the veil up to the window, watching the morning sunlight filter through its delicate weave, I realized that attempting to hide my condition would only give my family what they wanted. My shame, my compliance, my willingness to disappear so that their reputation could remain intact. But wearing the veil in a way that showcased rather than concealed my bare scalp would transform their act of cruelty into my declaration of independence. The sheer fabric would catch the light and draw attention to what they had done, making it impossible for anyone to miss or ignore. I began experimenting with different ways to arrange the veil, discovering that when positioned properly, it created an almost ethereal effect that made my bare head look intentional and striking, rather than tragic. The morning breeze drifting through my bedroom window felt different now, as it moved across my scalp, not like a violation, but like freedom. There was something liberating about feeling air against skin that had been hidden beneath hair for 3 decades, as if I were experiencing the world through a completely new sense. Each tiny current of air reminded me that I was alive, that I was making choices, that I was no longer the passive recipient of my family's manipulation. But I was too strategic to rely solely on the visual impact of my appearance. Ruth's mention of the doorbell camera had sparked a plan that was growing more sophisticated by the hour. I needed to approach this situation with the same careful calculation that had earned me a full academic scholarship and a successful career in marketing. Impulse and emotion had their place, but sustainable victory required planning evidence and multiple contingency strategies. I retrieved my laptop and began mapping out 2 distinct scenarios, treating this like any high-stakes business presentation I had ever delivered. Option 1 was the path of least resistance: proceed with the wedding ceremony as planned, maintain the family's precious image, and deal with the aftermath privately through conversations that could be denied or twisted later. This option preserved the social status quo and avoided immediate public drama, but it also meant that my parents' behavior would go unchallenged, and they would likely view my compliance as permission to continue treating me as expendable. Option 2 was far more dangerous, but potentially far more effective. Use the wedding reception as a platform to reveal the truth about what had happened, backed by whatever evidence Ruth and I could gather. This approach carried significant risks. It could destroy relationships, create lasting family rifts, and certainly end any hope of maintaining the peaceful facade that had defined our family's public persona for decades. But it also offered the possibility of genuine accountability and the chance to break a pattern of abuse that had clearly been repeating itself across generations. The key to making option 2 work would be timing and presentation. I needed to ensure that the wedding ceremony itself proceeded normally, both to honor my commitment to David and to avoid giving my parents any opportunity to sabotage the event before I could reveal the truth. But during the reception, when all of our community leaders and social influences were gathered in one place, when cameras were rolling and memories were being created, that would be the moment to let the truth speak for itself. I pulled out my phone and composed a carefully worded text message to Tommy Chen, the AV technician Ruth had mentioned. I remembered him vaguely from church, a quiet, serious young man who had always struck me as someone with strong moral convictions and little patience for injustice. My message was simple and direct. Tommy, this is Sarah Montgomery. I need your help with something important today. Can you meet me privately before the reception? And please don't mention this to anyone else yet. His response came back within minutes. Of course, Miss Sarah. I'll be setting up equipment at the club around noon. Whatever you need. I followed up with one more text, the words feeling like a loaded weapon as I typed them. Only play when I nod, not before. Outside my bedroom window, the sun was climbing higher in the Georgia sky, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. In a few hours, 200 people would gather to witness what they believed would be a celebration of love and family unity. They had no idea they were about to witness something far more significant, the moment when silence became speech, when secrets became truth, when a victim became a victor. Wedding dawn was rising, and I was no longer trembling, only fire burning in my heart. By 10 o'clock that morning, the bridal suite at Magnolia Hills Country Club had transformed into a hive of carefully orchestrated activity that came to an abrupt halt the moment I walked through the door. My 3 bridesmaids' college friends who had driven down from Atlanta for the weekend were already dressed in their sage green gowns, chatting easily with Francine Bordeaux, the makeup artist my mother had flown in from Savannah specifically because she had done the daughters of 3 state senators. The conversation died instantly. When they saw me, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and barely concealed horror as they took in my appearance. Francine recovered first, her professional training kicking in as she set down her makeup brushes, and approached me with the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield. She was a petite woman in her 50s with perfectly styled silver hair, and the kind of polished appearance that came from decades of making other people beautiful for their most important moments. Her reputation in Southern society circles was legendary. She was the artist who had painted faces for debutante balls, political fundraisers, and charity galas from Atlanta to Charleston. Never in her illustrious career had she been asked to work with a completely bald bride. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of sympathy and professionalism that Southern women master by middle age. "What in the world happened to your beautiful hair?" Before I could answer, my maid of honor, Jessica, stepped forward, her expression shifting from shock to protective anger. Jessica had been my roommate at the University of Georgia and was one of the few people who truly understood my family dynamics. She had witnessed enough Montgomery family gatherings to recognize manipulation when she saw it, and her journalist's instincts were clearly alerting her that something was seriously wrong with the official story. "Sarah, tell me this wasn't some kind of accident," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Because if someone did this to you deliberately, we're calling the police right now." The other bridesmaids, Amanda and Caroline, exchanged worried glances before Amanda whispered what they were all thinking. "This just doesn't feel right. I mean, this family has always been so focused on appearances and proper Southern hospitality. What kind of family lets something like this happen to their daughter on her wedding day? It's like everything we thought we knew about Southern grace and family support just got turned upside down." Her comment hit closer to the truth than she realized. The idea that a respectable Southern family would allow their eldest daughter to appear at her wedding looking anything less than perfect was so foreign to their understanding of our culture that they were struggling to process what they were seeing. In their world, families rallied around brides, protected them, ensured that their wedding day was flawless. The fact that I was standing before them looking like I had been through some kind of trauma was challenging everything they believed about family loyalty and Southern values. Caroline pulled out her phone, and I could see her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Within minutes, she was showing Amanda something that made both of them gasp. "Look at this," Caroline said, turning her phone toward Jessica. "The neighborhood Facebook group is already buzzing. Someone posted a picture of Sarah arriving this morning, and the comments are, well, they're not exactly supportive of your family." I moved closer to see what had captured their attention, and my stomach clenched as I read the comments appearing in real time on the Magnolia Hills Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Someone had clearly taken a photo of me walking from my car to the club entrance, and the image showed my condition in stark detail. The comments ranged from shocked sympathy to barely veiled criticism of my parents, with longtime neighbors questioning how such a thing could happen to a family they had always viewed as the gold standard of community values. "That family was always so perfect, though," read one comment that had already garnered 15 likes. "Makes you wonder what really goes on behind closed doors in these big houses." Another neighbor had written, "Something doesn't add up here. Margaret Montgomery would never let her daughter appear in public looking anything less than flawless unless something terrible happened." The speculation was spreading like wildfire with each new comment, adding fuel to the growing sense that the Montgomery family's carefully maintained reputation was beginning to crack under scrutiny. Francine cleared her throat, drawing our attention back to the immediate situation. "Well, whatever happened, we need to focus on making you look absolutely stunning for your big day," she said, her tone shifting into problem-solving mode. I've worked with cancer patients and actresses who've shaved their heads for roles. We can absolutely create something beautiful here. But I held up my hand, stopping her before she could continue with what I knew would be suggestions for concealment wigs or elaborate headpieces designed to hide what had been done to me. The fire that had been building in my chest since dawn was now burning steadily, fueling a confidence I had never experienced before. This was my moment to choose who I wanted to be: the victim who hid in shame, or the woman who transformed her trauma into strength. "Francine," I said, my voice clear and steady in a way that surprised even me. "I don't want you to hide anything. I want you to make me look strong, powerful, like a heroine from fairy tales who has been through battle and emerged victorious. I want every person in that ceremony to look at me and see courage, not tragedy." The room fell silent again, but this time the energy was different. Instead of shock and pity, I could feel something like admiration beginning to radiate from the women around me. Jessica smiled for the first time that morning, a fierce expression that told me she understood exactly what I was planning to do. The door opened. The groom stepped in. The entire room held its breath, waiting for his reaction. David Harrison stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, his hand still gripping the brass door handle as his eyes took in the scene before him. He was already dressed in his charcoal gray tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his face wearing the expression of a man who had come to steal a private moment with his bride before their ceremony. Instead, he found himself confronting a reality that no amount of wedding planning could have prepared him for. The silence in the room was deafening as my bridesmaids Francine and I waited to see how the man I was about to marry would react to discovering that his bride had been stripped of everything that traditional Southern society considered essential to feminine beauty. David's eyes moved slowly from my face to my bare scalp, then back to my eyes, and I watched as a dozen different emotions flickered across his features. There was shock, certainly, but also something deeper and more complex, a kind of recognition that seemed to cut through the surface of what he was seeing, to understand that this wasn't about hair or beauty or wedding day perfection. This was about something much more fundamental, something that would define not just our wedding day, but the entire foundation of our marriage. He stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, never taking his eyes off my face. The bridesmaids instinctively moved backward, creating space around us, as if they understood that this moment belonged to David and me alone. Even Francine busied herself organizing her makeup kit, giving us the illusion of privacy in the crowded preparation room. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I could hear years of love and commitment in the way he spoke my name. David moved toward me with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal, not because he was afraid of me, but because he seemed to understand intuitively that I was operating on pure adrenaline and determination, and that one wrong word or gesture could shatter the fragile composure I had built around myself. When he reached me, he didn't immediately touch my head or ask what had happened. Instead, he took both of my hands in his and gripped them tightly, his thumbs moving in small circles across my knuckles in the same soothing gesture he had used during the most stressful moments of our relationship. His hands were warm and steady, and I realized how much I had needed that physical anchor, that reminder that not everyone in my life was capable of betraying me. "Do you want to cancel the wedding?" he asked, his voice gaining strength but remaining soft enough that only I could hear him. "The decision is yours, Sarah. Completely yours. I'll follow you anywhere, to the altar, to the parking lot, to another state if that's what you need. None of this matters to me except what you want and what makes you feel safe." The offer was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything I had been conditioned to expect from this day, that I felt tears spring to my eyes for the first time since waking up that morning. David wasn't asking about photographers or guests or deposits or the social implications of calling off a wedding that half of Magnolia Springs had been anticipating for months. He was asking about me, about my comfort, about my agency, in a situation where everyone else seemed determined to make decisions on my behalf. "They drugged me," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could second-guess myself. Last night my parents gave me tea with something in it to make me sleep, and then Melissa threatened them. She said if they didn't cut off my hair, she would leave the family forever. So they chose her. They chose to humiliate me on our wedding day because keeping her happy was more important than protecting me. My voice was shaking as I spoke, but my eyes remained fixed on David's face, watching for any sign of doubt or disbelief, or the kind of rational skepticism that might lead him to suggest that I was overreacting or misunderstanding the situation. Instead, I saw his jaw tighten with anger, and his grip on my hands become more protective, as if he were trying to shield me from further harm through sheer physical determination. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, and I could see him processing the implications of what I had told him. David had always been analytical, the kind of man who approached problems systematically and looked for logical solutions. But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with reason or compromise. This was a deliberate act of cruelty committed by the people who were supposed to love and protect me most. "I'm here with you, not with an image," he said, his voice gaining the firm quality I had heard him use in business meetings when he needed to establish his position on non-negotiable issues. "I didn't fall in love with your hair, or your family's reputation, or their idea of what a proper Southern bride should look like. I fell in love with your intelligence, your kindness, your strength, and your ability to see through bullshit when everyone else is pretending everything is fine." He released one of my hands to gently cup my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "You're beautiful, Sarah. You're beautiful because you're you, not because you fit some template that other people created. And if your family can't see that, if they're willing to hurt you to protect their precious image, then they don't deserve to be part of our lives." The relief I felt at his words was overwhelming, like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone. I had an ally who understood that this wasn't about vanity or wedding day jitters, but about fundamental respect and human dignity. David's response told me everything I needed to know about the man I was about to marry, and the life we could build together free from the toxic patterns that had defined my childhood. But I still hadn't told him everything, and that secret was burning inside me. The moment of intimate connection between David and me was shattered by the sharp sound of heels clicking against the marble floor of the country club hallway. I recognized that particular rhythm immediately, my mother's purposeful stride when she was on a mission to control a situation that was spiraling beyond her management capabilities. The bridal suite door swung open without so much as a courtesy knock, and Margaret Montgomery swept into the room like a force of nature determined to reshape reality through sheer willpower and social conditioning. She was impeccably dressed in her Mother of the Bride ensemble, a champagne-colored silk dress that had been selected specifically to photograph beautifully against the country club's elegant backdrop. Her makeup was flawless, her hair arranged in the kind of sophisticated updo that required 2 hours with a professional stylist, and her smile was the practiced expression of gracious hospitality that she had perfected over decades of hosting community events. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like the picture of maternal pride and Southern refinement, preparing to celebrate her daughter's most important day. "David, sweetheart, you look absolutely handsome," she said, immediately moving to embrace him with the kind of warm familiarity she reserved for people she considered valuable assets to the family's social standing. "I hope you're not too overwhelmed by all the excitement. These big weddings can be quite an adjustment for people who come from more modest backgrounds." The subtle dig at David's middle-class upbringing was delivered with such smooth precision that someone unfamiliar with my mother's techniques might have missed it entirely. But I caught it. David caught it, and I could see from Jessica's expression that she had caught it too. My mother had a gift for inserting small cruelties into seemingly innocent conversations, planting seeds of insecurity while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Now then," my mother continued, turning her attention to me with the kind of forced brightness that indicated she was about to begin a campaign of damage control. "You still look beautiful in your own way, Sarah. Different, certainly, but we can work with different. The important thing is not to make a big deal out of this little setback, because the last thing we want is to embarrass ourselves in front of the neighbors and all the important people who have taken time out of their busy schedules to celebrate with us today. The words hit me like a series of calculated slaps, each phrase designed to minimize my trauma while maximizing my sense of obligation to protect the family's reputation. She wasn't asking me how I felt or whether I needed support or comfort. She was instructing me to prioritize her social standing over my own emotional well-being, just as she had been doing my entire life. The gaslighting was so smooth and practiced that I could almost admire the skill involved if it weren't being directed at me in one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. My father appeared in the doorway behind her, his presence adding weight to her words through silent authority. Charles Montgomery commanded respect wherever he went, not through warmth or charisma, but through the kind of old-fashioned patriarchal gravitas that still carried significant power in Southern social circles. He was dressed in his finest suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression carrying the stern disapproval of a man who expected immediate compliance with his expectations. "The guests are already arriving," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used during HOA board meetings when he needed to establish that discussion was over and action was required. "The pastor is here along with the mayor and several members of the city council. We have an obligation to these people, Sarah. They've come here expecting to witness a celebration of family values and Southern grace, not some kind of dramatic spectacle that will give them something to gossip about for months." The cultural pressure he was applying was expertly calibrated to hit every button my upbringing had installed. In our community, reputation was everything, and the idea of causing embarrassment to important guests was treated as one of the most serious social crimes imaginable. The pastor, the mayor, the city council members, these were the people whose approval determined a family's standing in Magnolia Springs society. Disappointing them wasn't just a personal failure. It was a betrayal of the community values that defined our entire way of life. Besides, my mother added, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a confidence, "We simply cannot afford to have anything go wrong today, not with everything we've invested in this event, and especially not with Melissa's situation being so delicate right now. You know she's been struggling financially since she quit her job, and we've been helping her with the credit card debt she accumulated trying to keep up with her lifestyle. The poor thing is already so sensitive about being dependent on us again, and if this wedding becomes some kind of scandal, it will just make her feel even worse about herself." The mention of Melissa's financial troubles was delivered with such casual matter-of-factness that it took me a moment to process the implications of what my mother had just revealed. Melissa had quit her job without telling me, was apparently drowning in credit card debt, and was receiving financial support from our parents' information that explained so much about the family dynamics that had led to last night's ultimatum. My sister wasn't just jealous of my wedding. She was financially dependent on our parents' continued favor, which gave them enormous leverage over her behavior and decisions. "Only Melissa knows the full extent of what we've had to do to keep her afloat," my mother continued, apparently unaware that she was providing me with crucial insight into the motivations behind the previous night's events. "She's been so grateful for our support, and so eager to find ways to contribute to the family. Sometimes I think she feels like she needs to prove her loyalty to us because we've been so generous with her during this difficult period." The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with devastating clarity. Melissa's ultimatum hadn't just been about jealousy or sibling rivalry. It had been about financial desperation and the fear of losing her parents' support if she didn't find a way to make herself indispensable to them. My humiliation had been the price of her continued solvency, and my parents had been willing to pay it without hesitation. I saw Aunt Ruth standing behind Mother, hearing everything, and her eyes flashed like a knife as if she was remembering a secret from grandmother's past. The flash of recognition in Aunt Ruth's eyes sent a chill down my spine, but before I could process what that look meant, she stepped forward and gently placed her hand on my mother's arm. "Margaret, dear, I think we should give Sarah and David a few more minutes alone before the ceremony," she said with the kind of quiet authority that had made her an effective teacher for 4 decades. Why don't you and Charles go check on the final arrangements with the caterers? I'm sure there are last-minute details that need your attention." My parents exchanged one of their wordless communications before reluctantly agreeing to leave, though I could see the frustration in my mother's eyes at being dismissed before she could complete her damage control mission. The moment the door closed behind them, Ruth turned to me with an expression that was both sympathetic and determined. "Sarah, I think it's time you heard what that doorbell camera actually recorded last night," she said, pulling her smartphone from her purse with the careful movements of someone handling dynamite. "I downloaded the footage this morning while your parents were busy with their preparations. They don't know I have access to their security system, and they certainly don't know what I discovered." My heart began racing as Ruth navigated to her phone's video gallery and selected a file that was time-stamped from the previous evening. The screen showed the familiar view from our front porch camera, the image quality surprisingly clear even in the dim lighting from the porch fixtures. For a moment, there was nothing but the peaceful suburban scene of our neighborhood at night, and then the audio began. The sound quality was slightly crackling due to the outdoor recording conditions, but every word was audible with devastating clarity. First came Melissa's voice, sharp and demanding in a way that made my skin crawl as I heard it played back. The ultimatum was even more chilling when removed from the drugged haze that had clouded my perception the night before. Her words cut through the quiet evening air like shards of glass. "Cut her hair off or you'll lose me forever. I swear to God, Mama, if you don't do this one thing for me, I will walk out of this house tonight and you will never see me again." My mother's response followed her voice thick with tears and the kind of desperation I had never heard from her before. "Please don't make me choose, Melissa. Please don't ask me to hurt Sarah like this. There has to be another way." But even as she protested, I could hear the weakness in her voice, the way she was already capitulating to my sister's demands, even as she pretended to resist them. My father's voice was harder to make out initially, but then it became clear as he moved closer to the front door, apparently returning from wherever he had gone to retrieve the clippers. "We'll do it quickly," he said, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were discussing trimming hedges rather than assaulting his own daughter. "She won't remember much of it anyway with the sedative. By tomorrow it will be done and we can all move forward." But then, underneath their familiar voices, I heard something that made my blood run cold. There was laughter in the background, distinctly male laughter that didn't belong to my father. The sound was muffled and distant, as if someone was standing further away from the recording device, but it was unmistakably there. Someone else had been present during this conversation, someone who found my family's plan amusing rather than horrifying. "Ruth, who is that laughing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as the implications of what I was hearing began to sink in. "There's someone else there. Someone who's not family." Ruth's expression darkened as she paused the recording. "I've been wondering the same thing, sweetheart. The timestamp shows this was recorded at 11:43 last night, and I know for certain that no guests were expected at the house. Your parents were very specific about wanting the evening to be family only so you could rest before the wedding." David leaned closer to examine the phone screen, his business background making him instinctively analytical about evidence and documentation. "Can you enhance the audio somehow? Maybe isolate that background laughter so we can get a better sense of who it might be." The question sparked something in my memory. A nagging sense that I had heard that particular laugh before, though I couldn't place where or when. The sound had a quality that suggested familiarity, as if whoever was laughing was comfortable enough in our family's presence to find their cruelty entertaining, rather than shocking. This wasn't a stranger who had stumbled onto a family crisis. This was someone who felt invested enough in the outcome to stick around and watch it unfold. Ruth scrolled forward through the recording, and we could hear more fragments of conversation as my family moved around the porch and front yard. The unknown voice became slightly clearer at one point, though still not clear enough to identify definitively. What was unmistakable, however, was the tone of encouragement, as if this person was actively supporting what my family was planning to do to me. Without hesitation, I grabbed my own phone and began the process of transferring the audio file from Ruth's device to mine. My fingers moved quickly across the screen as I created multiple backup copies and uploaded them to secure cloud storage, ensuring that this evidence couldn't be accidentally deleted or destroyed. The marketing executive in me understood the importance of controlling information, and I was determined that this recording would be preserved regardless of what my family might try to do to suppress it. "I need to get this to Tommy Chen immediately," I said, already composing a message to the AV technician. "If we're going to use this during the reception, he needs time to review the audio quality and figure out the best way to present it to the guests." As I typed, my mind was racing through the implications of what we had discovered. This wasn't just a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. The presence of an unknown third party suggested a level of premeditation and conspiracy that elevated what had happened to me from a moment of poor judgment to something far more calculated and cruel. Someone outside our immediate family had been involved in planning my humiliation, and that someone had found it entertaining enough to stay and watch it happen. The message to Tommy was brief but urgent. "Audio evidence from last night. Need you to review for technical quality ASAP. This changes everything." I attached the file and hit send, knowing that within hours, the truth about what had really happened would be heard by 200 of the most influential people in our community. Sister's voice rang out clearly. "Cut her hair." I had the key to open the gates of hell, but that key led to a family grave deeper than I imagined. The weight of the audio evidence was still settling in my mind when Ruth suddenly straightened her expression, shifting from sympathetic support to something more urgent and investigative. "Sarah, there's something else we need to check before the ceremony begins," she said, glancing at her watch with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing classroom schedules. "If we're going to present a complete picture of what happened, we need more than just audio. We need physical evidence that corroborates what we heard on that recording." David immediately understood the implication of her words, his business training kicking in as he recognized the importance of building a comprehensive case, rather than relying on a single piece of evidence that could potentially be dismissed or explained away. "You're talking about documentation," he said, his voice taking on the focused tone he used when analyzing complex problems. "Medical evidence, financial records, anything that proves premeditation and planning rather than a spontaneous family crisis." Ruth nodded approvingly at his grasp of the situation. "Exactly. And I happen to know that your parents are creatures of habit when it comes to disposing of evidence. Your mother has always been meticulous about cleaning up after family incidents, but she follows predictable patterns that can work against her when someone knows what to look for." The three of us made our way quietly through the country club's service corridors, with Ruth leading us toward the staff areas where she had observed the maintenance crew emptying trash from the member preparation rooms. She explained that the club's policy was to hold all refuse from special events for 24 hours, before final disposal, primarily for insurance purposes, in case valuable items were accidentally discarded during the chaos of wedding preparations. In a storage area behind the kitchen, we located the large rolling bins that contained the previous night's refuse from my family's house. Ruth had somehow convinced the maintenance supervisor to let us examine the contents, though she was characteristically vague about what persuasion techniques she had employed. As we began systematically searching through the bags, wearing latex gloves that Ruth had procured from the club's first aid station, I felt like we were conducting a forensic investigation rather than preparing for a wedding. The first significant discovery came when David located a small prescription bottle buried beneath coffee grounds and kitchen scraps. The label was partially stained but still legible, showing that it had contained lorazepam, a sedative medication prescribed for anxiety disorders. What made my breath catch was seeing the patient name clearly printed on the pharmacy label, Melissa Ann Montgomery. The prescription had been filled just 3 days earlier at Hartwell Family Pharmacy, the small local business where our family had maintained accounts for over 2 decades. "This doesn't make sense," I said, turning the bottle over in my gloved hands to examine the dosage information and refill instructions. "Why would Melissa have anxiety medication? And why would my parents be throwing away her prescription bottle?" Ruth's expression grew grim as she photographed the bottle from multiple angles with her smartphone, ensuring that every detail of the label was documented clearly. "Keep looking, sweetheart. I have a feeling this is just the beginning of what we're going to find." Our search continued methodically through several more bags until I discovered something that made my stomach lurch with recognition. Scattered throughout one particular trash bag were thick strands of dark brown hair, my hair, along with smaller clippings that had been swept up from wherever the cutting had taken place. The sight of my own hair discarded like refuse was deeply disturbing, but it also provided undeniable physical evidence of what had been done to me. More importantly, wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel at the bottom of the same bag, we found the electric clippers that had been used to destroy my appearance. The device was a professional-grade model, the kind used in high-end salons rather than for casual home haircuts, suggesting that someone had specifically acquired equipment capable of creating the kind of dramatic damage I had discovered that morning. When Ruth examined the clippers more closely under the storage room's fluorescent lighting, she pointed out faint but visible fingerprints on the handle and power switch. "We need to document everything exactly as we found it," David said, his voice taking on the methodical tone of someone who understood the importance of maintaining evidence integrity. "Photographs, measurements, anything that proves these items came from your family's house and were used last night." While we were cataloging the physical evidence, Ruth's phone chimed with an incoming email notification. She glanced at the screen and her eyebrows rose with surprise before she showed us what had appeared in her inbox. It was an automated receipt from Hartwell Family Pharmacy's online payment system forwarded to her because she was listed as an emergency contact on the family's medical accounts, a detail from years earlier when she had helped care for my grandmother during her final illness. But what shocked us wasn't that Ruth had received the receipt. It was whose name appeared as the purchaser of the lorazepam prescription. Instead of Melissa's name as we had expected, based on the patient information on the bottle, the payment had been processed using my father's credit card and email address. Charles Montgomery had personally purchased the medication that had been used to drug me despite the prescription being written for Melissa's supposed anxiety disorder. "This changes everything," David said, studying the email timestamp that showed the transaction had been completed at 4:37 the previous afternoon. "This wasn't your mother acting impulsively under pressure from Melissa. Your father was actively involved in planning what happened to you, and he was purchasing the means to drug you hours before Melissa's ultimatum." The implications were staggering. The narrative I had constructed in my mind of my mother being manipulated into a terrible decision by my sister's emotional blackmail was crumbling under the weight of evidence that suggested a much more calculated conspiracy. My father, the respected deacon and community leader who prided himself on moral authority and family values, had been planning my humiliation with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to HOA board meetings and church committee work. Ruth carefully forwarded the pharmacy receipt to both David and me, ensuring that we would have copies even if something happened to her phone or email account. She also took additional photographs of the prescription bottle, focusing on details that connected it to the email receipt: the prescription number, the pharmacy identification codes, and the date stamps that proved the medication had been acquired specifically for the previous night's events. As we prepared to leave the storage area, I realized that we had assembled a collection of evidence that would be impossible for my family to explain away or dismiss. The audio recording proved what had been said, and by whom the prescription bottle and receipt proved premeditation and planning, and the physical remains of my hair, along with the clippers, provided tangible proof of the assault itself. It was the kind of comprehensive documentation that could support criminal charges if I chose to pursue them, and it certainly provided more than enough evidence to destroy my family's carefully maintained reputation. Putting the pieces together, I had the complete picture of betrayal, and one missing piece was waiting to emerge from the grave of family secrets. Armed with our collection of damning evidence, we made our way back through the country club's corridors toward the bridal preparation area, where I knew the final hour before the ceremony would be filled with last-minute adjustments and the kind of nervous energy that always preceded major family events. But as we rounded the corner near the main ballroom, I found myself face to face with the person I least wanted to see at that moment. Melissa was waiting in the hallway dressed in her maid of honor gown and looking every inch the perfect Southern belle she had always been trained to be. She had positioned herself strategically near the entrance to the bridal suite, clearly intending to intercept me before I could retreat to the safety of my preparation room. Her appearance was flawless as always, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate updo that had probably required 2 hours with a professional stylist. Her makeup applied with the kind of precision that made her look like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot, and her sage green bridesmaid dress fitting her figure in a way that emphasized every curve. To any casual observer, she would have appeared to be the picture of sisterly support ready to help her older sibling through the final moments before walking down the aisle. But I could see something else in her eyes, something desperate and calculating that made my skin crawl with recognition. This wasn't the confident golden child who had issued ultimatums the night before. This was someone who had spent the morning watching her carefully orchestrated plan begin to unravel and who was now scrambling to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her management capabilities. "Sarah," she said, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone she had always used when she wanted something from me. "I was hoping we could have a few minutes alone before the ceremony. You know, sister to clear the air about everything that happened last night." David immediately stepped closer to me, his protective instincts clearly activated by something in Melissa's demeanor that struck him as threatening rather than conciliatory. Ruth also positioned herself slightly behind Melissa, close enough to intervene if the conversation took a turn toward confrontation. I could feel their support like a physical presence reminding me that I wasn't alone in facing whatever manipulation my sister was about to attempt. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Unless you're here to apologize for drugging me and destroying my appearance on my wedding day, I don't see what we have to discuss." Melissa's carefully constructed mask of sisterly concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and ugly underneath, before she managed to reassemble her expression into something resembling wounded innocence. "Sarah, you're being so dramatic about this. It's just hair and it will grow back. Besides, you look fine. Different but fine." The casual dismissal of what had been done to me was so perfectly in character that I almost laughed at the predictability of it. But then Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that was clearly meant to exclude David and Ruth from the conversation, and her next words hit me like a physical blow. "Do you think he only loves you?" she asked, her eyes flicking toward David with an expression that was impossible to misread. "I mean, really think about it, Sarah. What if there are things you don't know about his feelings? What if you're not as secure in this relationship as you think you are?" The question was delivered with such practiced malice that it took my breath away. This wasn't just about hair or wedding day drama or even financial dependency on our parents. This was about something much more personal and destructive. The suggestion that my relationship with David, the one thing in my life that had remained pure and untouched by my family's toxicity, might itself be built on lies or deception. I watched Melissa's face carefully as she continued her psychological assault, noting the way her eyes kept darting toward David, as if she were gauging his reaction to her words. There was something hungry in her expression, something that spoke of long-held desires and carefully nursed grievances that went far beyond normal sibling rivalry. She wasn't just trying to hurt me. She was trying to plant seeds of doubt that would poison my marriage before it even began. "You know, Sarah, there was a time when David and I spent quite a bit of time together." She continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that was clearly designed to suggest romantic rather than platonic interactions. "Those coffee meetings when you were working late, the conversations we had about your relationship, the way he used to look at me when he thought no one was watching. Did you ever wonder what we talked about during those long afternoons?" The words hit their intended target with surgical precision. I did remember those coffee meetings, though I had never thought of them as anything more than my sister's attempts to get to know the man I was planning to marry. David had mentioned them in passing, usually in the context of complaining about Melissa's tendency to monopolize conversations and turn every discussion back to herself. But now, filtered through my sister's poisonous insinuations, those innocent interactions took on a more sinister cast in my mind. I found myself studying David's face, looking for any sign of guilt or recognition that might validate Melissa's implications. But instead of the discomfort I might have expected if there were truth to her suggestions, I saw something else entirely, a kind of disgusted recognition, as if he were finally understanding the full extent of my sister's manipulation and psychological cruelty. "He used to look at me differently," Melissa added, her voice dropping to an even more intimate whisper. "Like he was seeing something in me that he couldn't find in you. I'm not saying anything happened, of course, but there was definitely a connection there. A spark. The kind of thing that makes you wonder what might have been if circumstances had been different." The lies were so transparent, so obviously designed to create maximum emotional damage, that I felt my anger crystallizing into something harder and more focused than rage. This wasn't just about destroying my wedding day or humiliating me in front of our community. This was about dismantling my entire sense of reality, making me question not just my family relationships, but the one romantic partnership that had given me hope for building a life free from their toxicity. But as I looked at Melissa's face, studying the desperate hunger in her eyes and the way her hands were trembling slightly as she delivered her carefully rehearsed poison, I realized that she had revealed more about herself than she intended. This wasn't the confident manipulation of someone who held power. This was the flailing attack of someone who had lost control and was trying to inflict as much damage as possible before being completely exposed. I responded coldly, "Today isn't your day," and her eyes flashed with anger, hiding an old wound. Melissa's flash of anger confirmed what I had suspected beneath her carefully constructed manipulations. Lay a wound that ran much deeper than simple sibling rivalry. But I didn't have time to analyze the psychological complexities of my sister's motivations. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours, and I needed to ensure that my carefully planned revelation would proceed without interference from my family's damage control efforts. With David and Ruth flanking me like protective sentries, I made my way toward the chapel where Pastor Williams was conducting his final preparations for the ceremony. I had known Pastor Williams since childhood, and while he had always been respectful of my family's prominent position in the congregation, I had also observed that he possessed genuine moral convictions that sometimes put him at odds with the social politics of our community. If anyone could be trusted to prioritize truth over reputation, it would be the man who had spent 30 years preaching about Christian principles to a congregation that didn't always want to hear them. I found him in the small preparation room behind the altar, reviewing his ceremony notes and adjusting his clerical robes with the methodical precision of someone who had officiated hundreds of weddings over the course of his pastoral career. When he looked up and saw my appearance, his expression shifted through the same sequence of shock and concern that I had witnessed in everyone else who encountered me that morning. But unlike my family members, Pastor Williams didn't immediately launch into explanations or damage control strategies. Instead, he simply waited for me to speak his patient silence, offering me the opportunity to tell my story in my own way. "Pastor Williams." I began, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be. "I need to ask something important of you today. I need you to perform the ceremony exactly as we planned, without any changes or interruptions, regardless of what you might hear about what happened to me last night. The wedding itself is sacred to David and me, and I don't want the actions of my family to contaminate that part of our day." He nodded slowly, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience with family crises and moral dilemmas. "Sarah, I can see that something terrible has happened to you, and I want you to know that whatever support you need from me, you have it. But I also need you to understand that if there are criminal matters involved, I have certain obligations as both a pastor and a community leader." The weight of his words settled around us like a blanket of moral gravity. Pastor Williams wasn't just offering me spiritual comfort. He was acknowledging that what had been done to me might require intervention from authorities beyond our church community. The validation was both reassuring and sobering, reminding me that I was dealing with something far more serious than a family disagreement. "I understand your obligations," I replied, and I'm not asking you to ignore them. But I am asking you to let me handle this situation in my own way at my own pace. Don't disrupt the ceremony, just let truth speak at the reception. Sometimes the most powerful justice comes not from legal intervention, but from community accountability and the natural consequences of people's actions being exposed to the light. Pastor Williams studied my face with the kind of intense attention he usually reserved for difficult theological questions, as if he were trying to read the condition of my soul through my physical appearance. After a long moment, he reached out and gently touched my hand, his gesture carrying all the pastoral care and spiritual authority that had made him a trusted leader in our community for 3 decades. "Sarah, I've watched your family for many years, and I've always sensed that there were currents running beneath the surface of your picture-perfect image," he said quietly. "If you're telling me that those currents have finally broken through in a way that has caused you real harm, then I believe you and I will support whatever approach you think will best serve justice and healing." His words gave me the confidence I needed to proceed with the next phase of my preparation. I made my way to the reception area where Tommy Chen was setting up the audio-visual equipment for the evening's festivities. He was exactly as Ruth had described him, a serious young man with an obvious dedication to technical precision and a quiet intensity that suggested strong moral convictions. When I approached him with my request to review the audio evidence and prepare it for potential presentation during the reception, he listened with the kind of focused attention that told me he understood the gravity of what I was asking. "Miss Sarah, I want you to know that your mother did speak to me earlier this morning," Tommy said, his voice carrying a note of apology that made my heart sink. "She asked me to be prepared to cut the audio system if there were any technical difficulties during the reception. She said the family was concerned about potential disruptions from guests who might have had too much to drink." The news hit me like a physical blow. My mother had anticipated that I might try to use the reception as a platform for revealing the truth, and she had already taken steps to prevent me from having access to the very technology I needed to share the evidence with our guests. For a moment, I felt the familiar sensation of being outmaneuvered by my family's superior experience with manipulation and control. But Tommy's next words restored my hope. "However," he continued, "I've listened to the audio file you sent me, and I've reviewed the documentation your aunt provided. What was done to you is morally reprehensible, and I won't be part of helping your family cover it up. I have backup systems and alternative presentation methods that your mother doesn't know about. When you're ready to share the truth, I'll make sure everyone hears it clearly." The relief I felt was overwhelming. Despite my mother's attempts at sabotage, I still had allies who were willing to prioritize truth over social convenience. Tommy's technical expertise combined with his moral conviction gave me confidence that my evidence would reach its intended audience regardless of my family's interference attempts. Ruth appeared at my side as if summoned by intuition, her presence adding another layer of support to my growing network of allies. "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happens today, you won't face it alone," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades standing up to bullies and manipulators in various forms. "If you need someone to testify about what they've witnessed, if you need someone to corroborate your story, if you need someone to stand with you when the consequences begin, I'll be there. I've been watching this family's toxic patterns for too long to stay silent any longer." The commitment in her voice was absolute, and I realized that Ruth wasn't just offering me support for this single confrontation. She was offering to help me break free from the cycle of abuse and manipulation that had defined my entire relationship with my family. With her backing combined with the technical support from Tommy and the unwavering love from David, I had assembled a coalition of people who were committed to ensuring that truth would prevail over image justice, over reputation, and healing over the perpetuation of generational trauma. Pastor Williams appeared beside us, having finished his final preparations for the ceremony. His presence completed the circle of support that I needed to move forward with confidence. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying both pastoral gentleness and prophetic strength, I've been thinking about what you said, and I want you to know that sometimes God uses the most painful experiences to expose the darkness that has been hiding in families and communities for generations. Pastor whispered, "Justice isn't loud, but it's clear, and today it will echo, breaking even the ghosts from the past." Pastor William's prophetic words still echoed in my mind as I found myself standing in the small anteroom behind the chapel's main doors, listening to the gentle murmur of 200 guests settling into their seats for what they believed would be a traditional Southern wedding celebration. The sound of their conversations created a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the heavy oak doors, punctuated occasionally by the rustle of programs and the soft click of high heels against marble floors as latecomers found their places in the pews. The church organist began the processional music, and the familiar strains of Pachelbel's canon filled the sacred space with the kind of solemn beauty that had accompanied countless brides down countless aisles for generations. But as the music swelled and echoed through the chapel's vaulted ceiling, it took on a different quality in my ears. Not the gentle accompaniment to a romantic procession, but something more like a battle hymn, a soundtrack for the kind of moral courage that transforms ordinary moments into defining ones. The sound seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, creating a rhythm that steadied my nerves and reminded me that this ceremony was about much more than the revenge I was planning for the reception. This was about David and me, about our commitment to building a life together that would be grounded in truth, rather than the elaborate deceptions that had characterized my family relationships. The music was calling me not just to walk down an aisle, but to step across a threshold from one kind of existence into another. I reached into my small beaded purse and pulled out the compact mirror that had been my grandmother's, its silver surface reflecting decades of Montgomery women preparing for their most important moments. But when I opened it and saw my reflection, I realized that the woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the frightened, humiliated victim who had stared into her bathroom mirror that morning. The woman in the compact had clear, determined eyes that reflected not shame, but a kind of fierce dignity I had never seen in myself before. My scalp, which had seemed so shocking and vulnerable in the harsh bathroom lighting, now appeared almost regal under the soft illumination of the chapel's preparation area. The fine bone structure of my skull was visible in a way that had been hidden beneath years of hair, and rather than making me look diminished, it seemed to emphasize the strength and intelligence that had always been my defining characteristics. I looked like someone who had survived something terrible and emerged not broken, but forged into something harder and more resilient than before. The sheer veil that I had chosen to showcase rather than conceal my condition caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, creating an almost ethereal effect that transformed what my family had intended as humiliation into something that looked almost like a crown. The fabric seemed to capture and hold the colored light from the chapel's windows, surrounding my head with a subtle nimbus that made me appear not like a victim, but like a warrior preparing for battle. I carefully adjusted the veil one final time, ensuring that it would flow properly as I walked down the aisle, and that every guest would have an unobstructed view of what had been done to me. This wasn't about vanity or appearance. It was about testimony, about bearing witness to the truth in a way that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Every step down that aisle would be a statement. Every photograph would be evidence. Every shocked whisper would be validation of what I had endured. My phone buzzed softly with a message from Tommy Chen, confirming that all technical systems were in place for the reception, and that he had successfully bypassed my mother's attempts at sabotage. His text was brief, but reassuring. "Everything ready on my end. Sound system fully operational with backup protocols. Waiting for your signal." I quickly typed my response, knowing that this would be my final communication before the ceremony began, and that everything depended on perfect timing and coordination. "Only play when I nod, not before." I wrote my fingers steady on the phone's keyboard despite the magnitude of what I was setting in motion. This has to happen exactly right, or it won't work at all. I hit send and then turned off the phone completely, not wanting any distractions during the ceremony itself. The die was cast, and there would be no turning back from the path I had chosen. Through the heavy doors, I could hear Pastor Williams beginning the traditional opening words of the wedding ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel as he invited the congregation to witness the sacred union that was about to take place. His tone was warm and welcoming, giving no indication of the dramatic revelations that would unfold just hours later in the reception hall. For now, this moment belonged to love and commitment, and the eternal hope that two people could build something beautiful together despite the brokenness of the world around them. Ruth appeared at my side, having slipped quietly into the preparation area to offer her final words of support before I began my walk down the aisle. She didn't say anything, words seemed inadequate for what was passing between us, but she squeezed my hand gently and nodded toward the doors, with an expression that conveyed both pride and determination. She understood that I was about to do something that would change not just my own life, but potentially the lives of everyone in our family, and her presence reminded me that I wasn't facing this transformation alone. The organist shifted into the opening notes of the bridal processional, and I could hear the congregation rising to their feet in the traditional gesture of respect for the bride's entrance. The sound of 200 people standing simultaneously created a wave of anticipation that seemed to roll through the chapel and crash against the doors where I waited. In just moments, those doors would open, and everything that came after would be irreversible. I took one final breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs as I prepared to step into the next chapter of my life. The fear that had dominated my morning had been replaced by something far more powerful. A sense of purpose that made my spine straighter and my chin higher. I was no longer the victim of my family's cruelty. I was the author of my own story, and I was about to write the most important chapter yet. The door swung open, the room held its breath, and I stepped in like a queen without a crown. The moment I stepped into the chapel, time seemed to slow to a crystalline stillness, as 200 pairs of eyes focused on my appearance with the kind of stunned attention usually reserved for natural disasters or shocking accidents. The collective intake of breath from the assembled guests created a sound like wind rushing through autumn leaves, and I could feel the weight of their stares as a physical presence that seemed to press against my skin from all directions. In the front row, I could see the mayor's wife, Helen Carmichael, her mouth falling open in undisguised shock, before she quickly composed herself and leaned toward her husband to whisper something urgent in his ear. Behind her, the president of the country club board, Robert Ashford, was staring at me with the kind of intense scrutiny he usually reserved for reviewing membership applications. His weathered face cycling through expressions of confusion, concern, and what looked suspiciously like the beginning of moral outrage. The church deacons, including my father's longtime colleague, Frank Morrison, were exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they were already beginning to piece together the implications of what they were witnessing. These were men who had spent decades working alongside my father in church leadership, men who had held up our family as an example of Christian values and proper conduct. The sight of the chairman's daughter appearing at her wedding in such a condition was clearly forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Montgomery family dynamics. But it was the reactions in the middle sections of the chapel that told me the most about how quickly this revelation would spread throughout our community. Martha Hendricks, who managed the neighborhood Facebook group and was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip, was discreetly holding her phone at an angle that suggested she was taking photographs despite the chapel's official no photography policy. Her fingers were moving rapidly across the screen, and I realized that images of my appearance were probably already being uploaded to social media platforms where they would be analyzed and discussed by hundreds of people within the hour. Several other guests were following Martha's lead, their phones appearing and disappearing with the practiced stealth of people who had mastered the art of covert social media documentation. I could see camera flashes being suppressed and screens being angled to avoid detection by the ushers, but the evidence was clear that my wedding ceremony was being transformed into the kind of viral social media event that would define conversations in Magnolia Springs for months to come. The visual contrast between my family members' reactions provided a stark illustration of their different roles in the previous night's conspiracy. Melissa, resplendent in her sage-green maid-of-honor dress, was standing at the front of the chapel with an expression of barely concealed triumph dancing across her perfectly made-up features. Her posture was relaxed and confident, her chin held high with the satisfaction of someone who believed their carefully orchestrated plan was proceeding exactly as intended. She looked like a woman who had won a significant victory and was savoring every moment of her opponent's public humiliation. My mother, positioned in the front pew in her champagne-colored Mother of the Bride ensemble, presented a completely different picture. Margaret Montgomery was sweating despite the chapel's air conditioning, and I could see her hands trembling as she gripped her pearl-beaded purse with white knuckles. Her carefully applied makeup was beginning to show stress cracks around her eyes, and her smile looked more like a grimace as she struggled to maintain her composure under the scrutiny of 200 guests who were clearly questioning what kind of family drama could result in such a shocking wedding day revelation. My father, standing stiffly beside her in his formal morning coat, was attempting to project his usual authority and control, but I could see the uncertainty flickering behind his eyes as he realized that their careful damage control strategies were completely inadequate for managing this level of public exposure. Charles Montgomery was a man accustomed to controlling narratives and managing community perceptions, but the visual evidence of what had been done to me was beyond the reach of his usual political and social maneuvering techniques. As I began my measured walk down the aisle, I could hear the whispered conversations beginning to ripple through the congregation like stones thrown into still water. The acoustics of the chapel carried fragments of these conversations clearly enough for me to make out individual comments, and what I heard confirmed that the community's reaction was even more dramatic than I had anticipated. "Good Lord, what happened to that poor girl?" whispered Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman who had taught Sunday school at our church for 40 years and was considered one of the moral authorities in our congregation. Her voice carried the kind of shocked concern that suggested she was already beginning to suspect that this wasn't a styling choice or medical condition, but something far more sinister. From somewhere in the middle of the chapel, I heard Vivian Blackwood, whose family had been prominent in Magnolia Springs society for 3 generations, murmuring to her companion in a tone that dripped with knowing significance. "Look just like their family legacy." I always wondered what really went on behind those perfectly manicured hedges and charity luncheons. The comment sent a chill down my spine because it suggested that our family's carefully maintained reputation for perfection had always been viewed with some skepticism by the older members of our community. Vivian's words implied that there were generational patterns and family secrets that extended beyond what I had discovered about my grandmother, patterns that longtime residents had observed but never openly discussed. Other fragments of conversation reached my ears as I continued my procession. "This has to be some kind of family crisis, and Margaret would never allow this unless something terrible happened. And that poor child, what could drive parents to let their daughter appear like this on her wedding day?" The collective tone was shifting from shock to sympathy to a growing sense of moral indignation that suggested the community was already beginning to turn against my parents before they even knew the full scope of what had occurred. But through all the whispers and stares and barely concealed photography, I kept my eyes fixed on David, who was standing at the altar with an expression of unwavering love and support that served as my anchor in the storm of social drama swirling around me. His face reflected none of the shock or concern that characterized the other guests. Instead, he looked like a man who was witnessing the courage of someone he deeply admired, someone who had chosen truth over comfort and authenticity over social acceptability. When I finally reached the altar and took his offered hand, I could feel the strength and steadiness of his support flowing through that simple physical connection. The chapel had fallen into a silence so complete that I could hear individual heartbeats and the soft rustle of fabric as people leaned forward to better observe this unprecedented moment in Magnolia Springs' social history. He squeezed my hand and spoke loudly, his voice echoing like a victory vow. David's voice cut through the chapel's stunned silence with the clarity and conviction of someone who had spent sleepless hours preparing for this exact moment. He hadn't released my hand since I reached the altar, and now he turned slightly toward Pastor William's microphone, ensuring that his words would carry to every corner of the sacred space where 200 of Magnolia Springs' most influential citizens sat transfixed by the unfolding drama. "Before we exchange vows," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "I want everyone here to understand something fundamental about the woman I'm marrying." The chapel fell even quieter, if such a thing were possible, the kind of absolute stillness that occurs when an entire room realizes they are witnessing something unprecedented and potentially historic. "I love your strength, not your hair or face, but the power you carry," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine as he spoke directly into the microphone. "I love the courage it takes to stand here today to face a room full of people when you've been hurt by the very family members who should have protected you. I love that you chose truth over comfort, authenticity, over appearance and justice, over the easy path of silence." The words hit me with such emotional force that I felt tears spring to my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of recognition and validation. The kind that come when someone sees you exactly as you are and loves you not despite your wounds, but because of the strength you've shown in surviving them. David's declaration wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a public testimony that challenged every person in that chapel to examine their own values and priorities. The reaction from the congregation was immediate and divided, creating visible fault lines that ran through the assembled guests like cracks in a foundation. From the middle and back sections of the chapel came a wave of emotional applause that started slowly with a few individuals and then built into something approaching a standing ovation. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly Sunday school teacher, was openly crying as she clapped, and I could see several other older women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs while nodding approvingly at David's words. Dr. Michael Harrison, David's uncle and a respected physician in our community, stood up from his seat in the third row and began applauding with the kind of dignified approval that carried significant social weight. His wife Patricia followed suit, and their public endorsement seemed to give permission for other guests to express their own emotional responses without fear of social judgment. The sound of their combined applause filled the chapel with something that felt like celebration and validation rather than mere politeness. But from the front section where my family and their closest allies were seated, the reaction was markedly different. My mother's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and I could see her shooting urgent glances toward my father as if searching for guidance on how to manage this public relations disaster. She was attempting to maintain her gracious smile, but the expression looked increasingly strained and artificial as it became clear that David's words were resonating with the majority of the congregation. Margaret Montgomery had spent decades perfecting the art of controlling social narratives, but this was beyond the scope of her usual damage control techniques. She couldn't dismiss David's declaration as scripted drama or family theatrics because it was clearly authentic and deeply felt, and she couldn't minimize its impact because the congregation's response was so overwhelmingly positive. I watched her lean toward the woman beside her, Virginia Caldwell, another prominent church member, and whisper something that made Virginia's eyebrows rise with apparent skepticism. My father's reaction was more controlled but equally telling. Charles Montgomery was a man accustomed to commanding respect through authority and social position, but David's public declaration had shifted the moral high ground in a way that left him looking defensive and uncertain. He was scanning the congregation with the calculated gaze of a politician trying to gauge public sentiment, and what he was seeing clearly wasn't aligning with his expectations for damage control. Pastor Williams stepped forward to continue with the ceremony, his expression reflecting both pastoral satisfaction and what looked like personal pride in David's courage. He had presided over hundreds of weddings in his 30-year career, but I suspected he had never witnessed a groom use his vows as a platform for moral testimony and public support of someone who had been wronged. His voice carried extra warmth as he invited us to proceed with the traditional ring exchange. The ceremony continued with remarkable smoothness despite the emotional intensity of David's declaration. When he placed the wedding band on my finger, his hands were steady and sure, and when I reciprocated with his ring, I felt like we were sealing not just a romantic commitment, but a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. The traditional words of the wedding liturgy took on deeper meaning in the context of what we had both just experienced and witnessed. As we moved toward the final portions of the ceremony, I noticed that the florist had arranged for small white roses to be placed on my veil during the recessional, a detail that had been planned weeks earlier, but now seemed almost prophetic in its symbolism. The delicate flowers resting against the sheer fabric created an effect that was both beautiful and dignified, transforming what my family had intended as a mark of shame into something that looked almost like a crown of honor. The congregation had settled into a different kind of attention, now no longer shocked by my appearance but focused on the profound emotional authenticity of what they were witnessing. The whispered conversations had largely ceased, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that accompanies genuinely sacred moments. Even the covert photography seemed to have stopped, as if people had realized they were witnessing something that deserved more reverence than social media documentation. But as we approached the conclusion of the ceremony, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision that made my stomach clench with renewed tension. Melissa was shifting restlessly in her position, as maid of honor, her earlier expression of triumph replaced by something that looked increasingly desperate and calculating. She was holding her phone in a way that suggested she was preparing to take some kind of action, though what that might be remained unclear. The sight of her clutching the device reminded me that while David's declaration had won us significant support from the congregation, the real battle was still ahead of us. The reception was where the complete truth would be revealed, where the evidence would be presented, and where the full scope of my family's betrayal would be exposed to the community that had trusted and respected them for decades. Sister bit her lip in the front row, clutching her phone like a final weapon. Melissa's desperate grip on her phone served as a stark reminder that while the ceremony had proceeded more smoothly than I could have hoped, the real confrontation was still hours away. But for now, Pastor Williams was guiding us through the final sacred moments of the wedding ritual, and I was determined to honor the sanctity of these vows regardless of the chaos that would inevitably follow. When the time came for the ring exchange, my hands were trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and emotion, but they remained steady enough to perform the ancient gestures that had united countless couples before us. David's fingers were warm and sure as he slipped the platinum band onto my finger, his touch serving as an anchor in the storm of social drama that continued to swirl around us. The weight of the ring felt substantial and real in a way that reminded me this ceremony was about something far more enduring than my family's temporary crisis. As I placed David's wedding band on his finger, I found myself focusing entirely on his face, blocking out the whispered conversations and barely concealed photography that continued throughout the congregation. His eyes reflected the same mixture of love and determination that had characterized his public declaration, and I realized that we were creating something beautiful and authentic in the midst of circumstances that could have easily destroyed any hope of genuine celebration. Pastor Williams invited us to seal our union with the traditional kiss, and when David's lips met mine, the chapel erupted in applause that was notably more enthusiastic than the polite response typically expected at such moments. The sound washed over us like a wave of community support, and I could feel the congregation's approval transforming what could have been a moment of public humiliation into something approaching triumph. But even as I savored the sweetness of that first kiss as husband and wife, I was acutely aware of the forced nature of my family's participation in this celebration. When I glanced toward the front pew during the applause, I could see my mother's smile stretched so tightly across her face that it looked more like a grimace, while my father was clapping with the mechanical precision of someone performing a duty rather than expressing genuine joy. The photographer, a professional my mother had hired from Atlanta specifically because of his reputation for creating elegant wedding portraits, was working overtime to capture images that could somehow minimize the visual impact of my condition. I watched him directing my parents through a series of formal poses, clearly struggling to find angles and lighting that would make their expressions appear natural and celebratory, rather than strained and defensive. Margaret Montgomery was a master of social performance, but even her considerable skills were being tested by the scrutiny of guests who were clearly questioning the family dynamics they were witnessing. I could see her adjusting her posture and facial expressions with each camera flash, trying to project maternal pride while her eyes remained guarded and calculating. The effort was exhausting to watch, and I realized that maintaining their perfect image was requiring more energy than ever before. My father's discomfort was even more apparent as he stood stiffly beside my mother, his usual commanding presence diminished by the obvious moral questions surrounding my appearance. Charles Montgomery was accustomed to being the authority figure in any social situation, but the congregation's reaction to David's declaration had shifted the dynamic in a way that left him looking defensive rather than dignified. Several guests were openly staring at him with expressions that suggested they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about his character and values. As we moved into the recessional, I could hear the whispered conversations resuming throughout the chapel. Though the tone had shifted from shock to speculation about what might be revealed during the reception, the guests were clearly anticipating that more information would emerge about the circumstances surrounding my appearance, and I could sense their collective curiosity building toward what promised to be a very interesting evening. Ruth appeared at my side as we prepared to leave the altar, her presence serving as both emotional support and a reminder that I had allies who would stand with me through whatever came next. She squeezed my hand briefly and whispered, "You've handled this beautifully, sweetheart. The hardest part is behind you now." But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The ceremony had been about love and commitment, while the reception would be about truth and consequences. As David and I walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I noticed that the congregation's attention had shifted subtly from my appearance to our relationship dynamic. The guests seemed to be focusing less on what had been done to me and more on how we were handling the crisis together, and I could see approval in many faces as they observed David's unwavering support and my own dignified composure. The photographer continued his work during the recessional, capturing images of our exit that would undoubtedly become part of the visual record of this unprecedented wedding. But instead of the triumphant celebration photos my mother had originally envisioned, these images would document something far more significant: a couple's commitment to truth and authentic love in the face of family betrayal and social pressure. When we reached the back of the chapel and stepped into the relative privacy of the vestibule, I finally allowed myself a moment to process what we had accomplished. The ceremony had been completed with dignity and grace, despite the circumstances, and we had managed to transform what my family intended as humiliation into a powerful testimony about the nature of real love and commitment. David pulled me close for a private embrace before we would be obligated to participate in the receiving line and post-ceremony photography that my mother had insisted upon. In that brief moment of intimacy, I whispered the words that had been building in my heart throughout the ceremony. "Tonight, truth will speak for itself, and we'll dance our first dance after. I promise you that whatever happens during the reception, we'll end this evening as we began it together and committed to building something real." His response was immediate and certain, his voice carrying the same conviction that had characterized his public declaration. "Sarah, whatever you need to do tonight, whatever truth you need to share, I'm with you completely. This isn't just your battle anymore, it's ours." The warmth in his eyes reminded me that I had gained more than a husband today. I had gained a true partner who would stand with me through whatever consequences emerged from exposing my family's betrayal. The reception hall was just steps away, where Tommy Chen would be making final preparations for the evening's festivities, and where 200 guests would soon gather expecting a traditional Southern celebration. Instead, they would witness something unprecedented in Magnolia Springs' social history: the complete dismantling of a family's carefully constructed facade and the triumph of truth over reputation. He nodded. "I'm right here." And now the party begins with a slow-burning bomb. The reception hall at Magnolia Hills Country Club had been transformed into the kind of elegant Southern celebration that would normally grace the pages of a wedding magazine, with cascading floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and round tables draped in ivory linens that reflected the soft glow of countless candles. The room buzzed with the animated conversations of guests who had clearly been energized rather than dampened by the dramatic ceremony they had just witnessed. And I could sense an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested everyone understood they were about to experience something unprecedented in the social history of our community. As David and I made our entrance as the newly married couple, the applause that greeted us carried a different quality than the polite congratulations typically offered at wedding receptions. There was something more substantial in the sound, something that felt like genuine support and validation rather than mere social obligation. The guests seemed to be applauding not just our union, but our courage in handling an impossible situation with dignity and authenticity. Ruth had positioned herself strategically near the head table, and as the applause died down, she rose from her seat with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in classrooms and faculty meetings. She lifted her champagne flute with deliberate ceremony, and the room gradually quieted as guests recognized that the evening's formal toasts were about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the reception hall with the kind of natural authority that had made her an effective educator for 4 decades. "I would like to propose a toast to something that we don't often have the privilege of witnessing in our daily lives: true courage in the face of adversity." The room fell into complete silence as Ruth paused, allowing her words to settle over the assembled guests like a benediction. She wasn't looking at me as she spoke, but everyone in the room understood exactly who and what she was referencing, and I could feel the collective attention of 200 people focusing on the subtext of her carefully chosen words. "Throughout my years as a teacher," Ruth continued, "I have been privileged to observe many different kinds of strength and resilience in the young people I've worked with. But the courage that impresses me most is that shown by women who silently endure what they should never have to endure, who carry burdens that were never rightfully theirs to bear, and who somehow find the grace to transform their pain into wisdom and their trials into testimony." The words hit their intended target with devastating precision, and I could see heads nodding throughout the room as guests began to connect Ruth's abstract praise to the very concrete evidence of trauma that my appearance provided. Several older women were visibly moved by her words, and I realized that Ruth was speaking not just about my situation, but about experiences that resonated with many of the women in the room who had faced their own family challenges and social pressures over the decades. "To Sarah and David," Ruth concluded, raising her glass higher, "may your marriage be built on the foundation of truth, respect, and the kind of authentic love that sees beyond surface appearances to honor the strength of the human spirit." The response to her toast was immediate and overwhelming, with glasses rising throughout the room, and applause that seemed to go on far longer than typical wedding reception etiquette would suggest. But this wasn't a typical wedding reception, and the guests seemed to understand that they were participating in something that transcended normal social conventions. As Ruth returned to her seat, I noticed that Harold Blackstone, an elderly man who served on the HOA board with my father and had known our family for decades, was rising from his table near the front of the room. Harold was in his 70s, with the kind of old-fashioned dignity that commanded respect in our community, and when he stood to speak, the room immediately gave him their attention. "I've lived in Magnolia Springs for 62 years. Harold began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the evolution of our community through multiple generations. "And in that time, I've learned that true beauty lies not in how we present ourselves to the world, but in how we treat each other when we think no one is watching." His words carried an unmistakable moral authority that seemed to fill the reception hall with the kind of ethical gravity that transforms casual social gatherings into moments of genuine significance. Harold wasn't just offering generic wedding wisdom. He was making a statement about character and values that clearly applied to the specific circumstances that had brought us all together that evening. "Some families teach their children that appearance is everything, that reputation matters more than relationships, and that maintaining an image is worth any sacrifice." Harold continued, his gaze moving deliberately toward the table where my parents were seated. But the strongest families are those that protect their most vulnerable members, that choose love over status, and that understand that real honor comes from how we care for each other in private, not how we perform for others in public. The impact of his words was electric, and I could see guests throughout the room turning to look at my parents' table, where my mother and father were clearly struggling to maintain their composure under this increasingly pointed moral scrutiny. Margaret Montgomery's smile had become so strained that it looked almost painful, while my father was staring at his plate with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone in the room. But it was Melissa's reaction that caught my attention most forcefully. She was no longer attempting to maintain even the pretense of sisterly support or wedding day joy. Instead, she was rolling her eyes with undisguised annoyance and leaning toward my mother to whisper urgent comments that were clearly complaints about the direction the evening was taking. Her mask of triumph from the ceremony had been replaced by something that looked increasingly desperate and cornered as she realized that the community response was not unfolding according to her expectations. The supportive atmosphere in the room was building like a wave with each toast and comment, adding to a collective sense that the guests were witnessing something significant and morally important. I could see alliances forming and reforming throughout the reception hall as people reassessed their understanding of our family dynamics and chose sides based on the evidence they were observing rather than the reputation they had previously accepted. Tommy Chen caught my eye from his position near the audio-visual equipment, raising his eyebrows in a subtle question about whether I was ready to proceed with the next phase of the evening's revelations. The technical systems were clearly in place. The crowd was receptive and engaged, and the moral foundation had been laid for what would follow. Everything was aligned for the moment of truth that would transform this wedding reception from a social celebration into a reckoning that would reshape relationships and reputations throughout Magnolia Springs. I felt David's hand squeeze mine under the table, his touch serving as both encouragement and reminder that I wasn't facing this moment alone. The decision was mine, but whatever I chose, he would stand with me through the consequences. The room was ready. The evidence was prepared, and 200 of the most influential people in our community were waiting to hear whatever truth I was prepared to share. I took the microphone, voice calm. Before we dance our first dance, I want to share a story. The microphone felt steady in my hand as I stood before 200 expectant faces, the weight of the moment settling around me like a mantle of responsibility. The reception hall had fallen into the kind of absolute silence that occurs when an entire room senses they are about to witness something that will be remembered and discussed for years to come. Even the waitstaff had stopped their quiet movements between tables clustering near the kitchen doors to observe whatever was about to unfold. Last night, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system that Tommy Chen had so expertly prepared. My family made a decision that they believed would remain private, hidden behind the closed doors of our perfect suburban home. They were wrong. I nodded slightly toward Tommy, who was positioned at his control station with the professionalism of someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to facilitate. His finger hovered over the play button for just a moment before he pressed it, and suddenly the reception hall was filled with the crackling but unmistakable sound of the previous night's doorbell camera recording. Melissa's voice cut through the elegant atmosphere like a blade, her ultimatum delivered with the same vicious clarity that had shocked me in my drugged state. "Cut her hair off or you'll lose me forever. I swear to God, Mama, if you don't do this one thing for me, I will walk out of this house tonight and you will never see me again." The reaction from the assembled guests was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed throughout the room, followed by the kind of shocked murmurs that occur when people are confronted with evidence of behavior so far outside the bounds of normal family dysfunction that it challenges their understanding of human nature. I watched faces throughout the reception hall as the reality of what they were hearing sank in. This wasn't speculation or gossip, but documented proof of a conspiracy to humiliate me on my wedding day. My mother's voice followed on the recording, thick with tears and desperation. "Please don't make me choose Melissa. Please don't ask me to hurt Sarah like this. There has to be another way." The vulnerability in her voice was painful to hear, but it was quickly overshadowed by my father's clinical response as he moved closer to the recording device. "We'll do it quickly. She won't remember much of it anyway with the sedative. By tomorrow it will be done and we can all move forward." But it was the mysterious laughter that sent chills through the reception hall, that distinctly male sound that didn't belong to any family member, suggesting that someone outside our immediate circle had been present during the planning and execution of my assault. The laughter was casual, even amused, as if the unnamed participant found the family drama entertaining rather than horrifying. The chaos that erupted in response to the audio evidence was unlike anything I had ever witnessed at a social gathering in Magnolia Springs. Margaret Montgomery shot to her feet with such violent force that her chair toppled backward, her face contorted with a mixture of panic and rage that shattered any remaining pretense of maternal dignity. "Fake!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "This is all fabricated. Someone turn it off right now. This is not what happened." Her denial was so obviously false, so clearly contradicted by the evidence that had just played through speakers positioned throughout the room, that several guests actually laughed at the absurdity of her claim. The technology was too clear, the voices too recognizable, and the emotional authenticity too genuine for anyone to believe that such a recording could have been artificially created with the kind of precision that would fool 200 witnesses. My father was attempting to maintain more composure than my mother, but I could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he realized that their carefully planned damage control strategies were completely inadequate for managing this level of public exposure. Charles Montgomery was a man accustomed to controlling narratives through authority and political maneuvering, but audio evidence played in front of the community's most influential citizens was beyond the reach of his usual techniques. But it was Melissa's reaction that provided the most dramatic entertainment for the assembled guests. Instead of attempting denial or damage control, she made the catastrophic decision to launch a counterattack using technology she clearly didn't understand well enough to employ effectively. She pulled out her phone with frantic movements and began playing what was obviously a hastily created audio file that was supposedly me confessing to staging the entire incident. The fake recording was so poorly executed that it would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetically desperate. The voice synthesis technology she had used created a robotic approximation of my speech patterns that bore only superficial resemblance to my actual voice, and the content was so obviously scripted that it sounded like a bad performance rather than authentic confession. "I staged this whole thing for attention," the artificial voice claimed in stilted, unnatural cadences. "I cut my own hair and made up the story about my family." The guests' reaction to Melissa's counterattack attempt was swift and merciless. Laughter rippled through the reception hall as people recognized the obvious artificiality of the recording, and I could hear comments like, "Does she really think we're that stupid?" And "This just makes it worse," floating through the crowd. What should have been her salvation had become additional evidence of her guilt and desperation. Tommy Chen, demonstrating both technical expertise and moral courage, took it upon himself to provide real-time analysis of Melissa's fake recording. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced through his own microphone, "I can confirm from a technical standpoint that what you just heard contains clear digital artifacts consistent with voice synthesis software. The authentic recording I just played shows no such technological manipulation." His professional assessment carried significant weight with the guests, many of whom understood enough about modern technology to recognize the difference between genuine audio evidence and hastily created fabrications. The contrast between the emotional authenticity of the doorbell camera recording and the obvious artificiality of Melissa's response served to validate the truth of what they had heard, rather than casting doubt upon it. The room was now in complete uproar, with conversations breaking out at every table as guests processed what they had witnessed and began discussing the implications with their neighbors. The social dynamics of decades were being re-evaluated in real time as people who had respected and admired my family for years were confronted with undeniable evidence of behavior that challenged everything they thought they knew about us. Through the chaos, I could see various community leaders, church board members, HOA officials, business owners huddled in intense conversations that clearly involved reassessing their relationships with my parents. The mayor's wife was shaking her head in disgust, while several deacons were looking toward Pastor Williams, as if seeking guidance on how to respond to this unprecedented moral crisis. But amid all the shock and outrage and social reorganization happening throughout the reception hall, I remained calm and focused, knowing that this was only the beginning of what I had prepared to reveal. The audio evidence had established the basic facts of what had been done to me, but the complete picture was far more complex and damaging than most people could have imagined. I smiled amid the chaos. Keep watching, because truth doesn't stop at sound, it starts from generational curses. The chaos in the reception hall was reaching a crescendo when Tommy Chen's voice cut through the noise with professional authority. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention for the visual evidence portion of this presentation. The large projection screen that had been installed for displaying wedding photos flickered to life, and suddenly the elegant reception hall was transformed into something resembling a courtroom where documentary evidence was being presented to a jury of my peers. The first image that appeared on the screen was a high-resolution photograph of the prescription bottle we had discovered in the trash. The pharmacy label clearly visible with Melissa's name as the patient and the medication identified as lorazepam, a powerful sedative used for anxiety disorders. But what made the audience gasp was the second image, the electronic receipt showing that the prescription had been paid for using my father's credit card and email address with a timestamp that proved the medication had been purchased the afternoon before my assault. The visual impact was devastating in its clarity. This wasn't speculation or hearsay, but documented proof that my father had personally acquired the means to drug me hours before Melissa's ultimatum had been delivered. The premeditation was undeniable, and I could see the realization dawning on faces throughout the reception hall that this hadn't been a spontaneous family crisis, but a carefully planned attack. The next series of images showed the physical evidence we had recovered from the trash photographs of my hair scattered throughout garbage bags, the professional-grade electric clippers that had been used to destroy my appearance, and close-up shots of the fingerprints that were still visible on the device's handle and power switch. The forensic quality of the documentation gave the presentation the weight of a criminal investigation, and several guests were leaning forward in their chairs as if they were watching a true crime documentary unfold in real time. But it was the final image that created the most dramatic response from the assembled guests. Tommy had somehow obtained a photograph of the discarded clippers alongside the prescription bottle and pharmacy receipt, arranged in a way that showed the connection between all three pieces of evidence. The visual told a complete story of conspiracy and premeditation that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. From somewhere in the middle of the reception hall, a voice called out with the authority of someone accustomed to analyzing evidence and legal implications. I recognized the speaker as Jonathan Webb, a prominent attorney who specialized in criminal defense and who had been a guest at our church for several years. His professional assessment carried significant weight in our community, and when he stood to speak, the room immediately gave him their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms evaluating the strength of criminal cases. "What we're looking at here constitutes sufficient grounds for a criminal investigation. This isn't family drama or domestic disagreement. This is documented evidence of assault, drugging without consent, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. These aren't matters that can be handled through family counseling or church mediation." His legal analysis sent shockwaves through the reception hall as guests who had been viewing this as scandalous entertainment suddenly realized they were witnessing the exposure of potentially criminal behavior by one of their community's most respected families. The social implications were staggering, and I could see various community leaders exchanging urgent glances as they began calculating the impact this would have on organizations and institutions where my parents held leadership positions. But the most compelling testimony came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Henshaw, an elderly woman who lived in the house directly across the street from my family's home, rose slowly from her table near the back of the reception hall. At 83, Dorothy was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who kept careful watch over community activities from her front porch, though most people dismissed her observations as the idle curiosity of an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. "I saw Margaret with those clippers," Dorothy announced, her voice carrying clearly, despite her age, "around midnight last night, standing on the front porch under the light fixture. I couldn't sleep because of my arthritis, so I was sitting by my bedroom window, and I watched her handling what looked like barber equipment while talking to that girl of hers. I thought it was strange at the time, but I figured it wasn't my business what the Montgomery family did on their own property." Her testimony provided the missing piece that transformed circumstantial evidence into eyewitness confirmation of the assault. Dorothy's reputation for accuracy and attention to detail was well established in our neighborhood, and her willingness to testify publicly about what she had witnessed gave additional credibility to all the other evidence that had been presented. The impact on my parents was immediate and catastrophic. My mother had progressed from panic to what appeared to be a complete emotional breakdown, sobbing openly while gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her carefully constructed social facade had crumbled entirely under the weight of evidence and community scrutiny, leaving behind a woman who looked fragile and defeated rather than dignified and authoritative. My father's reaction was more controlled but equally telling. Charles Montgomery was attempting to maintain some semblance of dignity, but the sweat beading on his forehead and the tremor in his hands betrayed the extent of his distress as he realized that his reputation, his community standing, and possibly his freedom were being destroyed in front of 200 of the most influential people in Magnolia Springs. The guests were no longer simply shocked observers, but active participants in a community reckoning that was reshaping social and moral boundaries in real time. I could hear fragments of conversations throughout the hall as people discussed the legal implications, the impact on church leadership, and the broader questions about family dysfunction that had been hidden beneath our community's polished surface. Melissa had retreated into sullen silence, her earlier attempts at counterattack having backfired so spectacularly that she seemed to realize any further efforts would only make her situation worse. She was slumped in her chair with the defeated posture of someone whose carefully laid plans had not only failed, but had accelerated her own downfall. My father finally attempted to speak, his voice barely audible above the continuing discussions throughout the reception hall. He began. But his words carried no conviction, no explanation that could possibly justify what the evidence had revealed about his role in planning and executing my assault. But I wasn't ready to hear his excuses or justifications. I had spent 32 years listening to my family's explanations for why their needs always took precedence over mine, why their comfort mattered more than my dignity, and why maintaining their image was worth any sacrifice on my part. The time for their voices had ended, and the time for mine had finally begun. Father stammered, But I raised my hand to stop him, eyes looking straight. "No, Dad, now it's my turn and the women before me." The silence I had imposed on my father created space for the final revelation that would expose the deepest motivation behind my family's betrayal. Tommy advanced the presentation to screenshots of text messages between Melissa and David dating back 18 months, revealing her persistent and inappropriate pursuit of my boyfriend despite his clear rejections. The early messages appeared innocent offers to help plan surprises, suggestions for coffee meetings to get to know Sarah's boyfriend better. But the timeline showed escalation into late-night texts where Melissa wrote things like, "I know you feel something for me too. I can see it in the way you look at me during family dinners. Sarah is so focused on her career that she doesn't even notice when you're trying to connect with someone who actually understands you." David's response was visible on screen. "Melissa, I need you to stop. I love Sarah and these conversations are inappropriate. I won't be responding to messages like this anymore." Call logs showed Melissa had been contacting David multiple times per week for months, often late at night when I would be asleep or working. The frequency painted a picture of someone actively pursuing her sister's boyfriend, despite his obvious disinterest. David stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I want everyone here to understand something clearly," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. I rejected Melissa's advances from the very beginning. I never encouraged her behavior, never gave her reason to believe there was mutual attraction, and never crossed any boundaries. She built these fantasies entirely on her own despite my repeated attempts to redirect her attention elsewhere. His public clarification was both necessary and devastating, providing clarity about his character while exposing the extent of Melissa's delusion. But the most explosive evidence came last, a text exchange between Melissa and our mother from 3 days before the wedding. Melissa's message read, "Mom told me to do this to keep him like Grandma kept Dad. She said sometimes you have to destroy the competition to protect what's yours, and that Sarah never deserved him anyway." The revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just family dysfunction, it was evidence of generational manipulation stretching back decades. The reference to grandmother suggested these toxic dynamics had poisoned family relationships for years. My mother began shaking her head violently. "That's not what I meant," she cried desperately. "I never told her to hurt Sarah. I just said that sometimes families have to protect each other from making mistakes." But her denials rang hollow against documented evidence. Pastor Williams rose with moral authority, his face reflecting disappointment. "This is not Christian behavior," he announced. "This is not family love. This is abuse disguised as protection and manipulation disguised as care." Several community leaders nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting moral certainty that my family's standing in Magnolia Springs had been permanently destroyed. Melissa's final desperate outburst provided the most dramatic conclusion. Unable to maintain composure, she leaped to her feet with such force her chair toppled backward, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. "He led me on," she screamed, pointing at David. "He smiled at me. He was nice to me. He made me think there was something between us. Sarah doesn't deserve him. She never did. She's cold and focused on her stupid career, and I would have made him so much happier." Her public breakdown exposed not just her delusions, but the generational cycle of twisted love that had taught her to view manipulation and destruction as acceptable tools for getting what she wanted. Sister screamed in the room, "He led me on," exposing her own darkest jealousy and the family's curse of twisted love. Melissa's screaming confession hung in the air like poison gas, and the immediate aftermath was swift and merciless. Before I could even process the full impact of her breakdown, I saw movement at the edge of the reception hall as Richard Pemberton, the country club's general manager, approached our table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to handling delicate social crises with diplomatic efficiency. Pemberton was a man who had built his career on maintaining the elegant atmosphere that made Magnolia Hills Country Club the premier venue for high society events, and his expression reflected the kind of professional concern that suggested he viewed my family's public meltdown as a direct threat to his establishment's reputation. He moved with deliberate purpose toward my mother and sister, his voice low but carrying enough authority to cut through the continuing chaos. "Mrs. Montgomery, Miss Montgomery," he said with the kind of polished courtesy that barely concealed his underlying firmness. "I'm going to have to ask you both to step outside so we can allow the reception to continue in a more appropriate atmosphere. We have other events scheduled this evening, and we need to maintain the elegant environment that our members expect from their club experience." The request was delivered with such professional smoothness that it took my mother a moment to understand she was being ejected from her own daughter's wedding reception. When the reality hit her, Margaret Montgomery's face cycled through shock, humiliation, and desperate anger before settling into the kind of defeated acceptance that comes when someone realizes their social capital has been completely exhausted. Melissa's reaction was more volatile, her emotional instability making it impossible for her to accept the dismissal with any semblance of grace. "You can't throw us out," she shrieked, her voice cracking with the kind of desperate fury that suggested she was finally understanding the full scope of what her actions had cost her. "This is our family's reception. We paid for this." But Pemberton's response was as smooth as it was final. "The club reserves the right to remove guests whose behavior disrupts the peaceful enjoyment of other patrons." This is clearly stated in our event contracts, which were signed by your parents." His words carried the weight of institutional policy and legal authority that made further argument impossible. As my mother and sister were being escorted toward the exit, Pastor William's assistant, Reverend Michael Foster, approached them with the kind of pastoral concern that was both genuine and strategically timed. Foster was a younger man who had always been more progressive in his approach to church politics, and his intervention seemed designed to provide spiritual guidance while also protecting the church from further association with their behavior. "Margaret Melissa," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to overhear. "I think it would be best if we step outside together so we can discuss this situation in a more private setting. The church community needs time to process what's been revealed here tonight, and I believe some reflection and prayer might be beneficial for everyone involved." His suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but everyone understood it was another form of ejection disguised as pastoral care. Foster whispered something to me as they passed. "This is a lesson for everyone about the importance of treating family members with genuine love rather than using them as tools for personal advancement." His words carried the weight of moral authority and suggested that the church leadership would be taking a very dim view of my family's behavior when they convened to discuss the evening's revelations. The institutional support for justice was both validating and sobering, as I realized that my parents' carefully cultivated religious reputation was crumbling along with their social standing. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the evening's aftermath was the wave of personal apologies that began flowing toward me from guests who had spent years accepting my family's perfect image without question. Eleanor Patterson. The elderly Sunday school teacher approached our table with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and genuine remorse written across her face. "Sarah, honey, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We all saw your family as the gold standard of Christian values and proper conduct. We once believed in that perfect image without looking deeper, and now we see karma working exactly as it should. I'm ashamed that it took something this dramatic for us to recognize what you've been enduring all these years." Her words were echoed by a steady stream of other community members who seemed compelled to acknowledge their own complicity in perpetuating the myth of Montgomery family perfection. The mayor's wife approached to express similar sentiments, followed by several HOA board members who were clearly distancing themselves from any continued association with my father's leadership. Dr. Harrison David's uncle summed up the community sentiment most eloquently. "Sometimes it takes a moment of complete transparency to reveal the difference between genuine character and carefully maintained facades. Tonight has been educational for all of us about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand what's really happening in people's lives." The social tide had turned completely, and I could see the satisfaction of justice playing out in real time as people who had ignored or dismissed signs of dysfunction for years were forced to confront the reality of what my family had been capable of. The karma was swift, comprehensive, and deeply satisfying in a way that felt like cosmic correction, rather than personal revenge. Through all of this social reorganization, my father had remained seated at his table, his face pale and his hands trembling as he watched his carefully constructed world collapse around him. When it became clear that even his longtime allies were abandoning him, Charles Montgomery finally attempted to salvage some dignity by making a dramatic gesture of remorse. He rose from his chair and began moving toward me with the obvious intention of kneeling in public supplication, his face reflecting the kind of desperate humiliation that suggested he was finally understanding the full scope of what he had lost through his actions. But I wasn't ready to accept his contrition or allow him to control the narrative of redemption. Father tried to kneel for forgiveness in the middle of the floor, but I said coldly, "Not yet. Justice is long, and it starts from Grandma's grave." My father's attempt at public contrition was still hanging in the air like an unanswered question when David rose from his seat beside me, his movement cutting through the tension with the kind of quiet authority that had characterized his support throughout this entire ordeal. The reception hall, which had been buzzing with conversations about social consequences and institutional responses, gradually quieted as guests recognized that the groom was preparing to speak again. David's presence beside me felt like an anchor in the storm of family destruction that continued to swirl around us, and when he took my hand, I could feel the steadiness that had drawn me to him in the first place. But instead of addressing the chaos that my family had created, he chose to focus on something more important and enduring: our future together and the family we would build from the ashes of the one that had betrayed me. Sarah and I want to thank everyone for witnessing not just our wedding today, but our commitment to building something different from what we've both experienced, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the reception hall with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the coldness of the preceding revelations. I love your strength, Sarah, and together we're going to build a real family, one based on honesty, respect, and the kind of unconditional love that protects rather than destroys. His words were simple and direct, but they carried the weight of a promise that extended far beyond typical wedding vows. This wasn't just a romantic declaration, it was a commitment to breaking the generational patterns that had poisoned my family relationships and creating something healthier for whatever children we might have in the future. The emphasis on building rather than inheriting felt particularly powerful given what we had just exposed about the toxic legacy that stretched back through multiple generations of Montgomery women. The response from the remaining guests was immediate and deeply moving. The applause that filled the reception hall carried a different quality than the shocked reactions that had characterized earlier portions of the evening. This was the sound of genuine celebration and emotional support from a community that had witnessed something truly redemptive amid the wreckage of family dysfunction. Eleanor Patterson, still dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, called out from her table near the front of the room, "That's what real marriage looks like." Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, and I could see other older women throughout the reception hall nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting the kind of recognition that comes from decades of observing relationships and understanding the difference between authentic partnership and social performance. Dr. Harrison's wife, Patricia, added her own validation. "You two have shown more genuine love and commitment in the past hour than many couples demonstrate in years of marriage. This is what it means to stand by someone when they need you most." Her words seemed to speak for many of the guests who had watched David's unwavering support throughout the evening's revelations, with obvious admiration and respect. The emotional support from the community felt like a warm embrace after years of feeling isolated within my own family, and I realized that while I had lost the people who should have loved me unconditionally, I had gained something potentially more valuable: a chosen family of friends and community members who had seen me at my most vulnerable and chosen to stand with me rather than judge me. When I turned to embrace David, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my cheek, I was overwhelmed by a sense of hope that I hadn't experienced in years. This hug felt different from any romantic gesture we had shared during our courtship. It was the embrace of true partners who had been tested by crisis and emerged stronger rather than broken. The symbolism wasn't lost on the assembled guests, many of whom had spent the evening watching a family disintegrate under the weight of its own toxicity. Seeing David and me find strength and unity in the midst of that destruction seemed to provide a kind of emotional catharsis for people who might have been questioning whether authentic love and healthy relationships were even possible in a world that often seemed dominated by manipulation and self-interest. Ruth appeared at our table, her face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served and truth validated. She squeezed my free hand and whispered, "This is how cycles break, not through revenge, but through choosing to build something better." Her words carried the weight of her decades as an educator and her understanding of how generational patterns could be interrupted through conscious choice and moral courage. The reception hall had transformed from a venue for social drama into something that felt more like a celebration of resilience and authentic connection. Guests were no longer focused on the scandal of what had been revealed, but on the hope represented by David's commitment and the community support that had emerged from witnessing our crisis together. But even as I savored this moment of warmth and validation, my peripheral vision caught movement that reminded me the evening wasn't over yet. Through the glass doors that led to the country club's outdoor terrace, I could see my mother pacing frantically while talking on her phone, her animated gestures suggesting she was engaged in an urgent and potentially desperate conversation with someone who wasn't present at the reception. The sight of her making what appeared to be a clandestine phone call sent a chill through me because I knew Margaret Montgomery well enough to understand that she wouldn't accept defeat without attempting one final manipulation or damage control strategy. Her body language suggested she was calling in favors, making threats, or perhaps arranging some kind of counterattack that could still turn the evening's triumph into yet another betrayal. David noticed the direction of my gaze and followed it to where my mother was gesticulating wildly while speaking into her phone. His expression darkened as he realized that our moment of peace and hope might be temporary, and that the woman who had orchestrated my humiliation might have one more card to play in her desperate attempt to salvage her reputation and maintain control over the narrative. Outside the glass door, Mother pulled out her phone to call someone, and that call might be the final poison. My mother's frantic phone conversation through the glass doors proved to be just the opening salvo in what would become a desperate digital warfare campaign orchestrated by Melissa from the parking lot of Magnolia Hills Country Club. Within minutes of being escorted from the reception, my sister had apparently decided that her only hope of salvaging the situation was to take her case directly to social media, bypassing the community leaders who had witnessed her breakdown firsthand. Tommy Chen's monitoring equipment picked up the live stream notification almost immediately, and he quickly patched the feed through to our main screen so the remaining guests could witness Melissa's final desperate gambit in real time. She was sitting in her car, her makeup streaked with tears, and her hair disheveled from her earlier outburst, but her voice carried the same manipulative confidence that had characterized her ultimatum the night before. "I need everyone to understand what really happened tonight." She began staring directly into her phone's camera with the kind of intense focus that suggested she believed this performance would somehow reverse the evening's disasters. "My sister Sarah has been planning this whole drama for months. She cut her own hair, made up these stories about our family, and staged this entire wedding reception scandal because she's always been jealous of the attention I get from our parents and our community." The lies were so transparently desperate that several guests in the reception hall actually laughed out loud, but Melissa pressed on with her narrative, apparently convinced that her version of events would somehow prove more compelling than the documented evidence that had already been presented. She claimed that the audio recordings were fabricated, that the text messages had been doctored, and that even her own public breakdown had been part of an elaborate scheme to frame her for crimes she hadn't committed. But the internet's response was swift and merciless. Within minutes of her live stream going live, viewers had begun flooding the comments with evidence that contradicted every element of her story. Someone had located and shared old social media posts where Melissa had bragged about her special relationship with David, including photos from family gatherings where she had deliberately positioned herself next to him, and captions that suggested romantic rather than familial affection. The hashtag #GoldenChildExposed began trending almost immediately, with users sharing their own stories of sibling favoritism and family dysfunction while expressing support for my courage in speaking truth to power. The comments section became a real-time fact-checking operation as viewers dissected Melissa's claims and provided counter-evidence that demolished her credibility with surgical precision. One particularly damaging discovery came when users found a video from Melissa's own social media account posted just 2 weeks earlier, where she had explicitly stated her belief that David was too good for Sarah, and that she could make him happier if he would just give her a chance. The video had apparently been posted during one of her late-night social media binges, and she had forgotten to delete it before launching her current damage control campaign. But Melissa's most catastrophic mistake came when she attempted to play what she clearly believed would be her trump card, a deep-fake audio recording that supposedly featured me confessing to staging the entire evening's revelations. The technology she had used was apparently the same amateur voice synthesis software that had failed so spectacularly during the reception, and the result was even more obviously artificial when played through her phone's inferior speakers. Tommy Chen's expertise proved invaluable once again, as he was able to provide real-time technical analysis that demolished any possibility that viewers might be fooled by Melissa's fabricated evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced through our sound system while simultaneously typing comments into the livestream chat. "The audio file she's playing shows clear digital artifacts consistent with low-quality voice synthesis software. Additionally, I can identify a watermark embedded in the file that traces back to scanning software used for digitizing grandmother's diary, suggesting this was created using source material from family documents rather than original recordings." His technical analysis was devastating in its precision, and the livestream comments exploded with accusations of fraud and demands that Melissa stop insulting their intelligence with such obviously fabricated evidence. The attempted counterattack had backfired so completely that it actually strengthened the case against her, while providing additional evidence of her willingness to lie and manipulate in pursuit of her goals. The final blow came when someone in the livestream chat identified themselves as a neighbor who had witnessed the previous night's events through their window, corroborating Dorothy Henshaw's earlier testimony and providing additional details about the timeline that made Melissa's alternative narrative completely impossible to maintain. The social media reckoning was both swift and comprehensive, with #BreakTheCycle joining #GoldenChild, exposed as trending topics that attracted national attention to our small-town family drama. Comments poured in from users around the country who recognized similar patterns of abuse and manipulation in their own families, turning my personal story into a broader conversation about generational trauma and the courage required to break toxic cycles. Realizing that her digital counterattack was failing as spectacularly as her earlier attempts at manipulation, Melissa made one final desperate move. She turned her phone's camera toward the reception hall's windows, trying to film the ongoing celebration as evidence that I was somehow celebrating her destruction, rather than simply trying to salvage my wedding day. But this gave me the opportunity I needed to deliver a final definitive statement that would end her ability to manipulate this narrative or intrude on my life going forward. I walked to the window where she could see me, clearly looked directly into her phone's camera, and spoke with the kind of calm authority that comes from finally understanding your own power. "Melissa," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the glass, and undoubtedly being transmitted to hundreds of viewers through her live stream. "This is the last time you will ever have any impact on my life. You've shown everyone exactly who you are, and I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your choices." The livestream chat erupted with supportive comments and applause emojis as viewers witnessed what they correctly interpreted as the final victory of truth over manipulation. I looked straight into livestream camera. "This is the last time you touch my life." And the screen went dark, leaving #BreakTheCycle trending. The abrupt end of Melissa's live stream created a moment of profound silence in the reception hall, as if the entire room needed time to process the complete dismantling of my family's carefully constructed facade. But instead of dwelling on the destruction, I realized this was the perfect moment to establish the boundaries that would define my future relationships and protect the life David and I were building together. I walked back to the microphone one final time, but instead of revealing more evidence or delivering additional accusations, I chose to focus on the most important element of healing, creating clear, non-negotiable boundaries that would prevent my family from continuing to inflict damage on my emotional well-being. I want to make something very clear to everyone here tonight. I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had finally found her power after years of being manipulated and controlled. Effective immediately, I am establishing a 6-month period of no contact with my parents and sister. All communication will go through lawyers, all future interactions will be documented, and these boundaries are not negotiable. These are the terms that will allow me to begin healing from what has been done to me. The public declaration felt both terrifying and liberating because it represented the first time in my life that I had prioritized my own emotional safety over my family's comfort and convenience. The guests seemed to understand the significance of what they were witnessing, not just the end of a dramatic evening, but the beginning of a new chapter where I would no longer accept abuse disguised as family loyalty. Several community members nodded approvingly at my boundary setting, and I could see respect in their faces as they recognized the courage it takes to cut ties with toxic family members, even temporarily. Eleanor Patterson called out softly, "That's exactly what you need to do, honey. Protect yourself first, and let them figure out how to earn back the privilege of being in your life." As the reception began winding down and guests started saying their goodbyes, Ruth approached me with the kind of grave expression that suggested she had been waiting for the right moment to share something important. She guided me to a quiet corner where we could speak privately away from the remaining conversations and cleanup activities. "Sarah," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of family history, "I need you to understand something about the pattern you've broken tonight. Your grandmother favored your mother exactly the same way your mother favored Melissa. I watched it happen when your mother was young, the same manipulation, the same emotional blackmail, the same willingness to sacrifice one child for another's benefit. This cycle of twisted love and competition has been poisoning our family for at least 3 generations." Her revelation provided crucial context for everything I had experienced, helping me understand that my abuse wasn't personal, but rather the continuation of a generational pattern that had been passed down like a toxic inheritance. The knowledge was both painful and liberating because it meant the cruelty I had endured wasn't about my inadequacy, but about a family system that had been broken for decades. But tonight, Ruth continued, her eyes bright with tears of pride. "You've done what your mother never had the courage to do. You've said no to the pattern, refused to pass it on, and chosen to build something healthier. This cycle stops here with you, and that's going to change everything for any children you might have in the future." David appeared at my side as Ruth finished speaking, and together we made the decision that would define the rest of our wedding night. Instead of staying at the country club for the traditional final dances and formal send-off, we chose to leave quietly and celebrate our marriage in a way that felt authentic to who we were, rather than who my family had expected us to be. We drove to Murphy's Roadhouse, a small bar on the outskirts of town that featured live music and a tiny dance floor where locals gathered for genuine fun rather than social performance. The contrast with the elegant country club reception couldn't have been more stark. Rough wooden floors, neon beer signs, and a crowd of people who had probably never heard of the Montgomery family drama, but welcomed us warmly when they learned we were newlyweds. David and I danced our first dance as husband and wife to a country song played by a 3-piece band that probably cost less than the flower arrangements at our reception. But it was perfect in a way that our formal celebration never could have been, because it represented our choice to prioritize authenticity over appearance, connection over performance, and joy over obligation. The laughter that filled that small roadhouse felt healing in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Strangers bought us drinks and shared stories about their own weddings, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could simply be happy without worrying about family drama or social consequences. This was what marriage was supposed to feel like: partnership celebration and hope for the future. As we prepared to leave Murphy's and head to our new home, David's phone buzzed with a notification that made both of us pause. It was an email from Hartwell Family Pharmacy sent to the emergency contact address that had been updated when Ruth gained access to the family medical accounts during my grandmother's final illness. The timestamp showed the message had been sent automatically as part of the pharmacy's routine records management, but the content was anything but routine. It appeared to be a historical archive notification triggered by our earlier inquiry about Melissa's prescription that was providing access to decades of medication records that had been stored in the pharmacy's digital backup systems. David and I exchanged glances that reflected both curiosity and apprehension, because we had already uncovered enough family secrets for one evening. But something about the timing of this final revelation felt significant, as if the universe was offering us one last piece of the puzzle that would complete our understanding of the Montgomery family dysfunction. On the way to our new home, an email from the pharmacy appeared, and it carried the final secret overturning the entire legacy. The pharmacy email that appeared on David's phone as we drove through the quiet streets of Magnolia Springs contained revelations that would fundamentally alter my understanding of everything that had transpired over the past 24 hours. As David pulled into our driveway and we sat in the car reading the message together, I felt the final pieces of a decades-long puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. The automated message was part of the pharmacy's digital records management system, triggered by our earlier inquiries about Melissa's prescription. But instead of just providing current information, the system had also retrieved historical records dating back to the 1970s, when electronic record-keeping first began at Hartwell Family Pharmacy. What it revealed was a pattern of medication abuse that stretched back through multiple generations of Montgomery women. The most shocking discovery was that the lorazepam prescription that had been used to drug me wasn't actually being used by Melissa for legitimate anxiety treatment. According to the detailed pharmacy records, she had been accumulating the medication over several months by claiming the pills weren't effective and requesting higher dosages, then hoarding the unused tablets instead of taking them as prescribed. The pattern suggested deliberate stockpiling rather than medical treatment. But the email's most damning revelation concerned my mother's role in this deception. The records showed that Margaret Montgomery had been the one initially requesting anxiety medication consultations for Melissa, claiming that her daughter was suffering from severe social anxiety that required pharmaceutical intervention. The pharmacy's notes indicated that my mother had been unusually insistent about obtaining sedatives, specifically, rather than the antidepressants or therapy that the pharmacist had initially recommended for anxiety treatment. The historical records painted an even more disturbing picture of generational abuse patterns. Scanning back through decades of Montgomery family prescriptions, the system had identified similar patterns of sedative accumulation dating back to the 1950s, when my grandmother had apparently used the same tactics to obtain medications that were then used for purposes other than legitimate medical treatment. A digitized prescription from 1954 showed my grandmother requesting nerve pills for my mother when she was just 16 years old, with pharmacy notes indicating that the teenager had never actually picked up the medication herself. Additional records from the late 1950s and early 1960s showed a pattern of my grandmother obtaining various sedatives and sleep aids, always claiming they were for family members who needed help with anxiety or insomnia. The most chilling discovery came in the form of handwritten notes that had been scanned as part of the pharmacy's historical digitization project. These notes, apparently written by the pharmacist in the 1960s, expressed concern about the Montgomery family's medication requests and suggested that the drugs might not be used for their intended purposes. One note specifically mentioned observing unusual behavior patterns in the family dynamic and wondering if the medications were being used to control rather than treat. David and I sat in stunned silence as we processed what this meant for our understanding of my family's dysfunction. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry or parental favoritism, it was evidence of a systematic pattern of using pharmaceutical drugs as tools of control and manipulation that had been passed down through 3 generations of Montgomery women. The realization that my assault had been orchestrated using techniques that my mother had learned from her own mother and that my grandmother had apparently pioneered in the 1950s was both horrifying and oddly validating. It meant that the cruelty I had experienced wasn't personal, but rather the continuation of a well-established family tradition of using vulnerable family members as pawns in psychological games. I immediately forwarded the complete pharmacy records to Jonathan Webb, the attorney who had provided legal analysis during the reception, knowing that this evidence could potentially support criminal charges if we chose to pursue that path. But as I composed the email, I found myself questioning whether legal revenge was really what I wanted from this situation. The evidence was certainly damning enough to destroy what remained of my family's reputation and possibly result in criminal prosecution for the medication-related offenses. But pursuing that path would mean spending months or potentially years reliving these traumas through depositions, court hearings, and legal proceedings that would keep me connected to my abusers, rather than allowing me to heal and move forward. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me in its maturity and wisdom. I chose to focus my energy on documentation and prevention rather than punishment and revenge. I spent the rest of that evening creating a detailed blog post that combined the pharmacy records with excerpts from my grandmother's diary, creating a comprehensive record of generational abuse patterns that could serve as a warning and resource for other families dealing with similar dynamics. The blog post, which I titled, "Breaking the Cycle: 3 Generations of Family Abuse," went viral within days of publication, attracting national attention from mental health professionals. Family therapists and advocacy groups focused on breaking patterns of generational trauma. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of people sharing their own stories of family manipulation and finding validation in my willingness to document and expose these patterns publicly. Several universities requested permission to use my documentation as case study material for courses on family systems and generational trauma, and I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for people who had survived similar experiences. The transformation from victim to educator felt both empowering and healing in ways that legal revenge never could have provided. But perhaps most importantly, the decision to choose healing over hatred allowed David and me to focus our energy on building the healthy relationship and family that would serve as the ultimate victory over my family's toxic legacy. We spent our first weeks as a married couple designing systems and communication patterns that would prevent the kind of dysfunction that had characterized my childhood from ever taking root in our own future family. The final email from the pharmacy had provided the missing piece I needed to understand the full scope of what I had survived and overcome. But instead of using that knowledge as a weapon against my abusers, I chose to transform it into a tool for healing and prevention that could help other people recognize and escape similar patterns before they caused irreparable damage. I chose truth over revenge, healing over hatred, and in that choice I found the power to break what grandmother started. When the last of the guests had left and the house was finally still, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror with scissors in hand. The harsh fluorescent light no longer felt like an interrogation, but more like a witness to something I had waited for. My hair, which had begun to grow unevenly from that night of forced humiliation, framed my face in tufts that no longer belonged to the frightened woman I once was. With each careful snip, I shed the remnants of their control. The locks fell quietly into the sink, and with every strand that dropped, I felt lighter, freer, almost reborn. When the final cut was done, the reflection staring back at me was not broken, but whole, crowned by a sharp, deliberate pixie cut that carried no shame. David stepped behind me, then his arms encircling my waist, his chin brushing my shoulder. His voice was warm and steady, the anchor I had leaned on without fully realizing it. "You're most beautiful when you're yourself," he whispered, pressing a kiss to the side of my cheek. And for the first time in longer than I could measure, I believed it, because what I saw in that mirror was not just a survivor, but a woman reclaiming her autonomy. The transformation did not end with scissors and mirrors. The weeks that followed brought a quiet but relentless pull toward something bigger than myself. Pain, I had learned, could fester, or it could be transfigured into purpose. I chose the latter. I walked into the local domestic violence center one afternoon, not entirely sure what role I could play. But as soon as I heard the stories of women who had been silenced, manipulated, or erased by their own families, I knew why I was there. My scars, invisible though they were, became bridges. One woman in particular clutched a folder of disorganized papers, evidence of her father's financial exploitation. She trembled as she spoke, afraid that no one would believe her. I sat with her, spreading out the documents across the table, guiding her hands to the right dates, the bank slips, the contradictions that formed a trail. I heard my own voice, steady and certain. This is how cycles really break. When we document, when we tell the truth, when we refuse to let their shame become ours. Her tears that day were not only of grief, but of recognition, the kind that sparks the first fragile flame of courage. In helping her, I realized I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer only fighting for myself, but for every woman who deserved to rise unshackled. Yet the work of healing did not stay confined to those walls. My grandmother's diary. The fragile notebook Ruth had preserved kept whispering to me even when I tried to set it aside. Her words, written decades earlier, traced patterns of silence and complicity in the family I had finally broken away from. I felt compelled to share it not as gossip, not as vengeance, but as testimony. One night I typed out passages pairing them with my reflections and posted them to a modest blog I had started almost absent-mindedly. I expected perhaps a handful of views, maybe a polite comment or two. Instead, the words rippled outward like a stone cast into still water. Within a week, neighbors whispered to me in the grocery store that they had read it. Within 2 teachers at the local high school were discussing it in staff meetings. By the end of the month, the blog had gone viral across our county, then farther shared on forums about breaking generational trauma picked up by advocacy groups who quoted my grandmother's lines as if they were scripture. Strangers wrote to me saying that in her diary and my commentary they recognized the skeleton of their own stories, and somehow, almost without my intending it, I had become a voice for something larger, a reminder that even the most carefully polished family portraits can hide cracks, and that acknowledging those cracks is the first step to real healing. The shift was startling, but grounding. Where once I had feared exposure, I now lived by it. Where once shame had been used as a weapon against me, I wielded truth as my shield and torch. And in doing so, I realized that legacy was not what my parents had tried to script for me in manicured images and whispered lies. Legacy was what we chose to pass forward, what we planted in others. My grandmother had left her words. Ruth had left her defiance. I was leaving my voice. And maybe, just maybe, that would mean my children and the children of those who read my words would never be asked to swallow humiliation in the name of keeping peace. Still, the past is never fully silent. There were moments when I would catch my reflection unexpectedly, and for a flicker I would see the bald head of that humiliated bride staring back. But then David's hand would find mine, or a woman at the center would smile at me with gratitude, or a stranger online would thank me for sharing what they had been too afraid to say aloud, and I knew those ghosts could not chain me anymore. My hair grew back, yes, but more importantly, my voice had grown roots. And so I stand here now, not in the shadows of their cruelty, but in the light of my own making. The scars of that night remain etched in memory, but they no longer dictate the terms of my life. They tried to strip me bare, to humiliate me into silence, but in doing so they revealed themselves to be the hollow shells they always were. Their legacy ended the night they reduced me to an object, because from that night on I refused to be anything less than whole. As for me, I only moved forward. I moved forward with my head held high, my new hair growing from the ashes, each strand a symbol of survival and defiance. I move forward with a husband who sees me not as a reflection of his status, but as a woman worthy in her own right. I move forward with a community that is beginning to listen, with women who know they are no longer alone, with a grandmother's words echoing louder than the silence she once endured. And I move forward carrying the fierce knowledge that a free generation is already taking root behind me. They shaved me bald to humiliate, but they stripped themselves bare instead, and the toxic legacy died. As for me, I only moved forward head held high, with new hair growing from the ashes and a free generation behind me. And that is how I chose to rise from the ashes, not as a victim, but as someone who turned pain into purpose and silence into a voice that others could follow. My story may be ending here, but the conversation does not have to stop. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you were in my place, would you have confronted your family in the same way, or would you have chosen a quieter path? Do you believe breaking cycles of abuse begins with private healing or with public truth? Share your perspective in the comments, because your experience may help someone else who is still searching for strength. If you found something meaningful in this story, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and join our growing community where we explore family drama, betrayal, and the victories that come when we stand up for ourselves.